Jessica was supposed to have a daughter. This is the fact that the entire Dune saga turns on, the hinge point, the single act of disobedience that redirected human history from the path the Bene Gesserit had spent 90 generations preparing. Jessica was ordered to produce a daughter with Duke Leto Atreides of Caladan. The daughter would carry the combined Atreides genetics into the next phase of the breeding program. The daughter would be married to Fade Ralpha Harkonnen, joining the two bloodlines in a union that the Sisterhood's genetic planning had determined would produce, in the next generation, the Kwisatz Haderach, the male Bene Gesserit, the superbeing whose capabilities would exceed what any previous human consciousness had achieved. Jessica produced a son instead. She gave Leto the male heir he wanted, defying the Sisterhood's orders out of love for the Duke, out of the decision that her emotional attachment to the man she served was more important than her institutional loyalty to the organization that had trained her and placed her. The son was Paul. Paul became Muad'Dib. Muad'Dib became the Emperor. The Jihad killed 61 billion people. The God Emperor ruled for 3,500 years. The scattering dispersed humanity across the unknown dark. Everything that followed, every event in the saga's 10,000-year narrative arc followed from Jessica's decision to produce a son rather than a daughter. But what if she hadn't? What if Jessica had obeyed? What if the Bene Gesserit's orders had been followed, and the child born to Jessica and Leto on Caladan had been the daughter the breeding program required? What would have changed? What would have remained the same? What would the universe have looked like without Paul Atreides, without the Kwisatz Haderach arriving one generation early, without the Fremen Messiah, without the Jihad, without the God Emperor and the Golden Path? The answer is not simple, because the consequences of the change cascade through every dimension of the saga's political, military, genetic, ecological, and philosophical landscape. The change is a single decision, daughter instead of son, and the decision's consequences reshape everything that follows. Not because the daughter would have been less capable than Paul, because the daughter would have been different in the ways that the breeding program's design specified, different in the ways that the political landscape's dynamics would have responded to, different in the ways that mattered for every event the saga documents. This is the story of that difference, the story of the daughter who was supposed to be born, the universe she would have inhabited, and the future she would have produced. The first thing to understand is what does not change. The Emperor's fear of Duke Leto does not change. Shaddam IV's assessment that the Atreides' political position threatened the Carino dynasty was based on Leto's qualities, on the Duke's popularity in the Landsrod, on the admiration that the Atreides governance tradition generated, on the political judgment that the Atreides represented an alternative to the Carino tradition that the Landsrod found attractive. The assessment was about Leto, not about Leto's heir. The assessment would have been identical whether the heir was a son or a daughter. The conspiracy does not change. The plan to transfer the Atreides to Arrakis, to place them in the position where the Harkonnen assault could destroy them with the Sardaukars' disguised participation, this plan was designed to eliminate the Atreides' political threat, which was Leto's threat, not the threat of any specific heir. The conspiracy was about House Atreides. The conspiracy would have proceeded regardless of the sex of Leto's child. The Harkonnen assault does not change. The Baron's forces, supported by the disguised Sardaukar, would have attacked the Atreides on Arrakis with the same timing, the same coordination, the same exploitation of Yua's betrayal that the conspiracy's planning specified. Yua's vulnerability, The leverage that the Harkonnens held through Wanna, his captured wife, was independent of the Atreides heir's identity. The betrayal would have occurred, the assault would have succeeded, Duke Leto would have died. The destruction of House Atreides' political and military position on Arrakis does not change. The household would have been scattered, the retainers killed or captured, the military capability destroyed. The assault's immediate consequences would have been identical in every dimension that the assault's planning encompassed. What changes is the aftermath. What changes is who flees into the desert with Jessica, what capabilities that person carries, and what the desert makes of them. The daughter, let us consider her carefully, because who she would have been determines everything that follows. The daughter would have been the biological child of Duke Leto Atreides and Lady Jessica of the Bene Gesserit. She would have carried the Atreides genetics, the intelligence, the physical capability, the quality of character that the Atreides bloodline had produced across generations of the house's history. She would have carried Jessica's genetics, the Harkonnen blood that the Bene Gesserit's breeding program had placed in Jessica without Jessica's knowledge, the cognitive quality that the Harkonnen contribution added to the genetic configuration. Genetically, the daughter would have been Paul's equivalent. The same parents, the same genetic inputs, the same biological raw material. The difference was not in the genetics. The Bene Gesserit's breeding program was managing the genetics at a level that did not distinguish between male and female expressions of the same genetic configuration. The daughter would have carried the same genetic potential that Paul carried. The difference was in what the potential would have been developed into. The daughter would have been Bene Gesserit trained. This is the critical distinction, not the genetics, but the training. Jessica would have trained the daughter in the Bene Gesserit disciplines from childhood, as the Sisterhood's placement protocol required. The daughter would have received the Prana Bindu training, the voice, the observational capabilities, the body-mind integration that the Bene Gesserit tradition produced. The training would have been comprehensive, conducted by a mother who was herself among the Sisterhood's most capable practitioners, in the environment of the Atreides household where the training could be conducted without interference. The daughter would not have been Mentat trained. This is the second critical distinction. Paul received Mentat training from Thufir Hawat, the human-computer disciplines that supplemented his Bene Gesserit capabilities with the analytical processing that the Mentat tradition provided. The daughter would not have received this training. Not because women could not be Mentats. The Imperium's conventions did not prohibit female Mentats in principle, but because the Bene Gesserit's management of the daughter's development would have directed her training along the Sisterhood's lines rather than along the Mentat lines. The daughter was the breeding program's product. The breeding program's plan for the daughter was the Bene Gesserit path, not the Mentat path. The daughter would not have been the Kwisatz Haderach. This is the most consequential distinction of all. The Kwisatz Haderach was a male Bene Gesserit, a person whose male neurology could access the dimensions of other memory that female Reverend Mothers could not reach. The daughter, being female, would have had the standard Bene Gesserit access to other memory through the spice agony, the female ancestral presences, the matrilineal chain of consciousness that every Reverend Mother accessed. She would not have had access to the male dimension, the patrilineal presences that the Kwisatz Haderach's male neurology was supposed to unlock. This means no prescience, or rather, no prescience of the kind that Paul developed, the full-spectrum prescient vision that allowed Paul to see the probability space in its entirety, to navigate the future's branching possibilities with the comprehensive awareness that the Kwisatz Haderach's combined male-female access to other memory produced. The daughter might have developed some degree of limited prescient awareness through the spice. The melange enhanced cognitive function in ways that could produce glimpses of probable futures in sufficiently sensitive individuals. But the full prescient faculty that Paul developed, the vision that allowed him to see the jihad, to see the golden path, to navigate the political landscape with the awareness of a consciousness that could perceive multiple timelines simultaneously, this would not have been available to the daughter. Without the prescience, the daughter's political and military options on Arrakis would have been fundamentally different from Paul's. Paul's ascendancy among the Fremen was built on the prescient faculty's demonstrated capability, on the ability to see the future that made Paul more than a skilled warrior and a capable leader, that made him a figure of religious significance in a culture whose mythology had been prepared by the Missionaria Protectiva to receive a messianic figure with exactly these capabilities. The daughter would have been skilled. The daughter would have been capable. The daughter would not have been the Lisan al-Gaib. The flight into the desert after the Harkonnen assault is the first point at which the divergence produces materially different outcomes. Jessica and Paul fled into the desert through the storm, carried by a combination of Jessica's Bene Gesserit capabilities and Paul's emerging prescient awareness. The desert was hostile. The sandstorms, the worms, the environmental conditions that killed unprepared humans with the efficiency that Arrakis's ecology demanded. Survival in the deep desert required knowledge that neither Jessica nor Paul possessed when they entered it, and the survival was achieved through the combination of Bene Gesserit capability, Atreides training, and the gradual acquisition of desert skills that their time among the Fremen provided. Jessica and the daughter would have faced the same desert, the same storms, the same worms, the same environmental hostility. Jessica's capabilities would have been identical. The Bene Gesserit training that allowed her to manage her body's response to the environment, to assess the dangers the desert presented, to make the survival decisions that the conditions required. The daughter's capabilities would have been different from Paul's in the dimensions discussed. No mentat processing, no emerging prescience, but similar in the fundamental Bene Gesserit skills that the desert survival's immediate demands required. The immediate survival, the physical survival of the desert's environmental challenges would have been possible. Jessica was capable enough to manage the desert's immediate threats, and the daughter's Bene Gesserit training would have provided the physical and mental tools that the survival required. The initial period, the days of desert travel, the navigation toward the Sietch communities that Jessica's knowledge of the Missionaria Protectiva's work told her were there, would have been manageable. The encounter with the Fremen is where the divergence deepens. The Fremen's reception of Jessica and Paul was shaped by the Missionaria Protectiva's work, by the religious legends that the Bene Gesserit's missionary arm had planted among the Fremen generations earlier, legends designed to provide protection for Bene Gesserit operatives who might find themselves among the desert people. The legends included the prophecy of the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, the messianic figure who would lead the Fremen to their promised destiny. Paul fit the prophecy. His off-world origin, his capabilities, his demonstrated prescience, his ability to ride the sandworm, his integration into Fremen culture, all of these confirmed in the Fremen's religious framework that Paul was the figure the prophecy had described. The confirmation was progressive, built across the months and years of Paul's desert period, each demonstrated capability adding to the religious identification that the Missionaria Protectiva's work had prepared the cultural ground for. The daughter would not have fit the prophecy in the same way. The Lisan al-Gaib prophecy was gendered, the messianic figure was male, described in terms that the Fremen's cultural expectations associated with masculine leadership. A daughter, a young woman from the outer world, carrying Bene Gesserit capabilities, but not the prescient faculty that the prophecy's most consequential elements described, would not have activated the religious response that Paul activated. This does not mean the Fremen would have rejected Jessica and the daughter. The Missionaria Protectiva's protections were not limited to the Lisan al-Gaib prophecy. The planted legends included multiple layers of religious protection designed to provide Bene Gesserit operatives with safe passage among prepared populations. Jessica herself was a Reverend Mother, or would become one through the Spice Agony, as she did in the original timeline, and the Reverend Mother's status carried weight in Fremen culture that was independent of the Lisan al-Gaib prophecy. The reception would have been different in character rather than in kind. The Fremen would have received Jessica and the daughter. The reception would have been the reception of a Reverend Mother and her acolyte, respected, accommodated, integrated into the Sietch community with the hospitality that the Fremen tradition extended to people whose status their cultural framework recognized. The reception would not have been the reception of a Messiah. This distinction, respected guest versus prophesied savior, is the distinction that reshapes everything that follows. Because the distinction determines the daughter's relationship with the Fremen, and the relationship determines the daughter's capacity to do what Paul did, transform the Fremen from a civilization maintaining itself in the desert into a military force capable of destroying the Imperium's established order. The daughter's integration into Fremen society would have followed a different path from Paul's, and the different path would have produced a different outcome. Paul's integration was driven by the messianic identification. The Fremen accepted Paul not simply as a capable person who needed shelter, but as the prophesied figure whose arrival signified the beginning of the transformation their religious tradition promised. This identification gave Paul a status that exceeded what his individual capabilities, however impressive, could have earned through their own merit. The status was religious. The authority it conferred was prophetic. The loyalty it generated was the loyalty of believers rather than the loyalty of followers, and the distinction between believers' loyalty and followers' loyalty is the distinction that determines the scale of what the loyalty can produce. The daughter's integration would have been driven by capability rather than by prophecy. The daughter would have had to earn her position in Fremen society through the demonstration of the skills and the qualities that the Fremen's cultural framework valued: the combat capability, the desert skills, the personal qualities that the Fremen's intensely meritocratic social structure recognized and rewarded. The daughter could have earned a respected position. The Fremen's culture was not hostile to female capability. The Reverend Mothers, the Sayadina, the women of the Sietch communities occupied positions of significant authority, and the daughter's Bene Gesserit training would have provided her with capabilities that the Fremen's assessment framework could evaluate and respect. But the ceiling was different. A respected member of the Sietch was not a Messiah. A capable woman in Fremen society was not the Lisan al-Gaib. The daughter could have risen within the Fremen social structure to a position of influence, could have become a significant figure in the Sietch community's leadership, could have contributed to the Sietch's military and political operations with the capabilities her training provided. The daughter could not have commanded the civilizational loyalty that Paul commanded, could not have mobilized the entire Fremen population in the service of a vision that the population's religious framework identified as divinely ordained. The difference in the loyalty's quality would have produced a difference in the loyalty's scale, and the difference in scale would have determined the military and political outcomes that the loyalty produced. Paul mobilized millions. The Fremen's entire population, the deep desert communities, the Sietch warriors, the full military capability of a civilization that had been forged by the desert's demands across millennia, was mobilized in the service of the Muad'Dib's vision. The mobilization was total. The mobilization was religious. The mobilization produced a military force that overwhelmed the Sardaukar and destroyed the Carino dynasty's position in a single afternoon. The daughter could not have produced this mobilization. Not because she lacked the capability to lead. The Bene Gesserit training and the Atreides heritage provided leadership capability that exceeded what most of the Imperium's political actors possessed. Because she lacked the religious authority that transformed leadership capability into civilizational mobilization. The Fremen would have followed a capable leader. The Fremen would not have worshipped one. And the difference between following and worshipping is the difference between a political movement and a holy war. Without the holy war, the political landscape of Arrakis does not change in the way that Paul's presence changed it. The Fremen remain what they were before Paul, a civilization of extraordinary capability, maintaining itself in the desert, resisting the Harkonnen governance, conducting the low-intensity warfare that the desert's strategic depth supported. The Fremen do not become a conquering army. The Fremen do not ride sandworms through a breached shield wall. The Fremen do not destroy the Sardaukar in an afternoon. The Carino dynasty does not fall. The political landscape of the Imperium without Paul's revolution would have continued along the trajectory that the Carino dynasty's 10,000-year management had established, with the modifications that the Atreides' destruction and the Harkonnen consolidation would have produced. The Harkonnens would have recovered Arrakis. The Baron's plan, the destruction of the Atreides, the recovery of the spice fief, the resumption of the governance that the transfer to the Atreides had interrupted, would have succeeded in its entirety. The Harkonnens would have governed Arrakis again, with the same exploitative approach that had characterized the previous 80 years of Harkonnen governance, producing the spice revenue that the CHOAM framework required, and managing the Fremen as the security nuisance the Harkonnen assessment classified them as. Rabban would have been installed as planetary governor, as the Baron's plan specified. The Baron's two-phase strategy, Rabban's harsh governance followed by Fade Routher's ameliorative governance, would have proceeded according to the Baron's design. Rabban would have crushed the population with the harshness the plan required, extracting the maximum spice revenue while generating the hatred that the plan's second phase would exploit. Fade Routher would have arrived as the saviour, the beautiful heir who replaced the brutal governor, the Harkonnen who looked like a liberator because his predecessor had been made to look like a tyrant. The plan was cynical. The plan was also competent. The Baron's strategic intelligence was sufficient for the design and execution of a governance transition that would have produced the political outcomes the plan specified. Without Paul's intervention, the plan would have worked. The Harkonnen governance of Arrakis would have transitioned from Rabban's harshness to Fade's presentation of reform, and the political narrative the Baron was constructing would have served its purpose. The Fremen would have endured. Without the messianic mobilization that Paul's presence produced, the Fremen would have continued their desert existence in the form that preceded Paul. The Sietch communities maintaining themselves through the water discipline and the survival practices that millennia of desert existence had refined, the military capability sustained at the level that the desert's conditions produced, the resistance to the Harkonnen governance conducted at the low-intensity level that the strategic situation supported. The Fremen's terraforming dream, the long-term ecological transformation that Pardok Kynes had initiated and that the Fremen had been pursuing for generations, would have continued. The planting, the water collection, The ecological modification that the terraforming program specified would have proceeded at the pace the program's timeline required. The dream was generational, was designed to produce results across centuries rather than decades, was sustained by the Fremen's cultural commitment to a future that the current generation would not live to see. Jessica's role in the Fremen community would have been the role of a Reverend Mother. The Spice Agony, the ordeal that transformed a Bene Gesserit into a Reverend Mother through the internal conversion of the Water of Life, would have occurred as it did in the original timeline. Jessica would have undergone the ordeal, would have survived it through her Bene Gesserit capabilities, would have assumed the Reverend Mother position within the Sietch community that the ordeal's completion conferred. The Reverend Mother's position was significant, but not transformative. Jessica, as the Sietch's Reverend Mother, would have held the spiritual authority that the position carried, the access to other memory, the role in the community's spiritual life, the advisory function that the Reverend Mother's wisdom and her accumulated ancestral knowledge provided. The position was respected. The position was influential. The position was not the Lisan al-Gaib's position. The Reverend Mother advised. The Messiah commanded. The daughter would have grown up in the Sietch, would have been raised in the Fremen tradition alongside whatever Bene Gesserit training Jessica continued to provide, would have learned the desert skills, the stillsuit discipline, the sand navigation, the worm riding that Fremen children learned as part of their cultural education, would have developed into a person who combined the Atreides heritage, the Bene Gesserit training, and the Fremen cultural formation in a configuration that was different from Paul's, but that carried its own quality and its own potential. The daughter would have been, in the Fremen community's assessment, a valued member, a person whose capabilities the community recognized and whose contributions the community valued. The daughter would not have been the community's transformation. The daughter would have been one of the community's members, distinguished by her capabilities, but not elevated by her prophetic status. The Bene Gesserit's plan for the daughter was not the Fremen community's assessment. The Bene Gesserit's plan was the breeding program, and the breeding program's timeline did not stop because the Atreides had been destroyed. The Sisterhood would have known where Jessica was. The Bene Gesserit's intelligence network, the observation and communication capabilities that the Sisterhood maintained throughout the Imperium's political landscape, would have tracked Jessica's survival. The Sisterhood's interest in Jessica and the daughter was not contingent on the Atreides' political position. The interest was genetic. The breeding program's plan for the daughter was independent of the Atreides house's political fate, because the plan was about the daughter's genetics rather than about the daughter's politics. The plan was the Fade-Rotha marriage, the daughter carrying the Atreides Harkonnen genetic combination that the breeding program required would be married to Fade-Rotha Harkonnen, carrying the Harkonnen genetics that the breeding program's complementary line represented. The marriage would combine the two lines. The children of the marriage, the next generation's product of the combined genetics, would include, if the breeding program's calculations were correct, the Kwisatz Haderach. The plan's execution would have required the extraction of the daughter from the Fremen community and her placement in the circumstances that the marriage required. This extraction would have been the Sisterhood's most consequential operational challenge in the what-if scenario, because the extraction required the cooperation, or the management, of multiple actors whose interests did not align with the breeding program's objectives. The Baron would have had to be managed. The marriage of an Atreides-born woman to the Baron's heir was not a proposal the Baron would have welcomed without persuasion. The Atreides were the Harkonnens' enemies, and the marriage of the enemy's daughter to the Harkonnen heir would have been politically and personally objectionable to a man whose career had been organized around the Atreides' destruction. The Bene Gesserit would have had to persuade the Baron that the marriage served his interests, or the Bene Gesserit would have had to compel the marriage through the political mechanisms the Sisterhood controlled. The persuasion was possible. The Bene Gesserit's capabilities included the management of political actors through the combination of information, leverage, and the subtle influence that the Sisterhood's trained operatives could bring to bear on the decisions of the people they were managing. The Baron was manageable, was susceptible to the arguments that the Bene Gesserit could construct about the marriage's political benefits, was vulnerable to the leverage that the Sisterhood's knowledge of his activities and his secrets could provide. The Baron might also have been bypassed. The Baron was not immortal. The disease that the Bene Gesserit had given him was progressive, and the Baron's health was declining across the timeline that the breeding program's plan was operating on. If the plan's execution was delayed until after the Baron's death, or until after Feyd-Rautha had assumed the Harkonnen leadership, the objection to the marriage might have been removed along with the objector. Feyd-Rautha himself was the more interesting variable. Feyd was young, ambitious, politically intelligent in the way that the Baron's grooming had produced, and physically impressive. Feyd's response to the proposed marriage would have depended on the political context in which the proposal was made, and on the Bene Gesserit's management of the presentation. If the daughter was presented as a political prize, a connection to the Atreides bloodline that provided the legitimacy the Harkonnen name lacked, a bridge to the Landsraad houses whose respect for the Atreides tradition made the Atreides connection politically valuable, Feyd might have been receptive. The Harkonnens were wealthy and powerful. The Harkonnens were not respected. The Atreides were destroyed, but still admired. A marriage that connected the Harkonnen future to the Atreides legacy might have served Feyd's political ambitions in ways that the young man's assessment of his own interests could accommodate. The marriage would have been, in any case, the Bene Gesserit's objective, and the Sisterhood's operational capability was sufficient for the management of the political obstacles the objective required overcoming. The marriage would have happened. The timeline would have varied months, years, perhaps a decade between the Atreides' destruction and the marriage's arrangement. But the marriage would have happened because the Bene Gesserit's institutional commitment to the breeding program's plan was not contingent on the convenience of the timeline. The daughter's experience of the marriage would have been shaped by the Bene Gesserit training that had prepared her for exactly this kind of political placement. The Bene Gesserit trained their operatives for placement in noble households. The training included the management of the relationship with the husband, the political, personal, and biological dimensions of the marriage that the placement required. The training included the management of the household, the navigation of the court's politics, the maintenance of influence within the governance structure, the cultivation of the alliances and the intelligence networks that the Sisterhood's institutional purposes required. The training included the management of reproduction, the biological control that the Prana Bindu disciplines provided, the capacity to determine the sex of the child that the placement's breeding program objectives specified. The daughter would have been trained for this, not by the abstract institutional apparatus of the Sisterhood, by Jessica, who had been through a placement of her own, who understood from personal experience what the placement required and what the placement cost. Jessica's training of the daughter would have been informed by the experience of the Caladan placement, the experience of being placed with Duke Leto, of developing the emotional attachment that the placement's professional requirements did not accommodate, of facing the conflict between institutional loyalty and personal feeling that Jessica's own experience had documented. Jessica's instruction would have included the warning that the placement was professional, that the emotional attachment was a risk the professional function could not afford, that the experience of the placement included the possibility of the attachment, and that the attachment's development was the thing the training was designed to prevent. Jessica would have told the daughter, "I was placed with your father. I was supposed to maintain the professional distance. I did not. The consequences of my failure to maintain the distance were the consequences that brought us here, to the desert, to the sietch, to the diminished circumstances that my disobedience produced." The daughter would have received this instruction from a mother whose personal experience demonstrated both the instruction's importance and the instruction's difficulty. Jessica's disobedience, the production of Paul rather than the ordered daughter, was the act that the instruction was designed to prevent in the next generation. The daughter would have understood that the instruction was not abstract, that the risk of emotional attachment was real, that the consequences of acting on the attachment were visible in the circumstances the daughter and her mother were living in. Whether the daughter would have followed the instruction is a question that the what-if scenario cannot definitively answer, because the answer depends on the daughter's personal character, on the qualities of temperament and disposition that the genetics and the environment produced in the person the daughter would have been. The Bene Gesserit training was designed to produce compliance with the institutional plan. Jessica's personal example demonstrated that the training's design was not always sufficient. The daughter might have complied. The daughter might have resisted. The scenario must consider both possibilities. The compliant daughter, the daughter who followed the Bene Gesserit's plan, would have been the breeding program's most important placement since the program's founding. The marriage to Fade Routher would have been conducted according to the Sisterhood's specifications. The daughter would have entered the Harkonnen household as Fade's wife, a political marriage arranged for genetic purposes, conducted within the social framework that the Imperium's noble houses maintained for the management of inter-house unions. The household would have been hostile. The Harkonnen institutional culture was not the Atreides institutional culture, the warmth, the loyalty, the governance service tradition that the Atreides household had maintained on Caladan was not the Harkonnen way. The Harkonnen household operated through the mechanisms the Baron had developed: the intimidation, the exploitation, the treatment of people as instruments rather than as persons. The daughter, raised in the Atreides tradition and formed by the Fremen culture's demanding but communal ethic, would have entered a household whose operating principles were antithetical to everything she had been raised to value. The Bene Gesserit training was designed for exactly this challenge. The trained operative was supposed to be capable of functioning in hostile environments, of maintaining her institutional mission in conditions that were personally uncomfortable, of managing the relationship with the household's leadership in ways that served the Sisterhood's objectives regardless of the household's culture. The training said, "You are not there for your comfort, you are there for the breeding program. Your personal experience of the placement is secondary to the placement's institutional function." The daughter would have managed the Harkonnen household, would have navigated the court's politics with the Bene Gesserit capabilities the training provided, would have assessed the household's power dynamics, identified the leverage points, cultivated the relationships that the Sisterhood's intelligence network required, would have managed Fade, would have used the combination of capability and subtlety that the Bene Gesserit's tradition of political placement had refined across centuries of practice. The management of Fade would have been the placement's most consequential dimension. Fade was not Leto. Where Leto had been principled, honest, governed by the Atreides tradition's commitment to integrity, Fade was ambitious, ruthless, formed by the Harkonnen tradition's commitment to the acquisition and exercise of power. The management of Fade would have required different tools from the tools Jessica had used with Leto, not the mutual respect and the emotional connection that the Atreides placement had produced, but the careful navigation of a relationship with a person whose values and whose methods were organized around principles the daughter would have found repellent. The daughter would have produced the child. This was the placement's purpose, the production of a child whose genetics combined the Atreides Harkonnen lines in the configuration that the breeding program's calculations specified. The child would have been conceived according to the Sisterhood's plan, produced with the biological control that the Prana Bindu training provided. Born into the circumstances that the Harkonnen household's conditions created, the child would have been a son. The breeding program's plan specified a male. The Kwisatz Haderach was a male Bene Gesserit, and the breeding program's purpose was the production of this male. The daughter's biological control would have ensured the child's sex, producing the male heir that the program required. The boy who would carry the combined genetics of both lines, the boy who would be, if the program's calculations were correct, the Kwisatz Haderach. The Kwisatz Haderach, produced on schedule rather than one generation early, would have been a fundamentally different figure from Paul Atreides. The difference was not in the genetics. The genetic configuration that the breeding program was designed to produce was the same, regardless of the generation in which it was produced. The difference was in the conditions of production and development, in the environment the Kwisatz Haderach was born into, in the training the Kwisatz Haderach received, in the institutional framework within which the Kwisatz Haderach's capabilities were developed and deployed. Paul was produced accidentally. The Kwisatz Haderach arrived one generation early. In circumstances the breeding program had not planned for, carrying capabilities the program was not prepared to manage. Paul's development was uncontrolled, conducted outside the Sisterhood's institutional framework, shaped by the Fremen's cultural environment and by the prescient faculty's emergent development rather than by the breeding program's managed cultivation. Paul was a wild product, the Kwisatz Haderach without the institutional management that the Kwisatz Haderach's power required. The planned Kwisatz Haderach, the son of the daughter and Fade Rautha, would have been produced deliberately. The boy would have been born into circumstances the breeding program had designed, into the institutional framework that the Sisterhood's management of the Harkonnen placement had created, under the observation and the guidance of the Bene Gesserit operatives, whose role was the monitoring and the cultivation of the program's product. The boy would have been trained from birth. The Bene Gesserit's training protocols for the Kwisatz Haderach, the specific cultivation program that the Sisterhood had developed across decades of preparation for the eventual product's emergence, would have been applied from the earlier stages of the boy's development. The training would have been designed to develop the Kwisatz Haderach's capabilities within the framework the Sisterhood's institutional purposes required, to produce a super being whose power was channeled through the Sisterhood's objectives rather than developing independently of them. The institutional management would have been the critical difference. Paul's prescient capability, developed without management, emerged in the desert, shaped by the spice environment and the Fremen's cultural context, producing a consciousness whose power was oriented toward the Fremen's messianic expectations rather than toward the Bene Gesserit's institutional objectives. The planned Kwisatz Haderach's capabilities would have been managed, developed within the framework the Sisterhood designed, oriented toward the objectives the Sisterhood specified, channeled through the institutional infrastructure the Sisterhood maintained. The Sisterhood believed this management would produce a controllable Kwisatz Haderach. This belief was the breeding program's foundational assumption. The assumption that the superbeing's power could be produced and managed within the institutional framework, that the Kwisatz Haderach would be the Sisterhood's tool rather than the Sisterhood's master, that the cultivation's design would ensure the product's compliance with the cultivator's purposes. The assumption was almost certainly wrong. The assumption that the managed Kwisatz Haderach would be controllable was wrong, because the assumption misunderstood what the Kwisatz Haderach was. The Bene Gesserit's conception of the Kwisatz Haderach was the conception of a tool, a superbeing whose capabilities exceeded what any previous consciousness had produced, whose power was the product of the breeding program's design, whose allegiance was to the institution that had produced him. The conception assumed that the production's design would determine the product's orientation, that the Kwisatz Haderach, because he was produced by the Sisterhood for the Sisterhood's purposes, would serve the Sisterhood's purposes. The assumption failed to account for what prescience did to the person who possessed it. Paul's experience demonstrated this. The prescient faculty did not simply add a capability to the person who carried it. The prescient faculty transformed the person. The ability to see the probability space, to perceive the branching futures, the consequences of every choice, the outcomes of every decision across the time scales that the prescient vision encompassed, produced a consciousness that was fundamentally different from the consciousness the Sisterhood's training had shaped. A prescient consciousness did not take orders. A prescient consciousness could not take orders, could not accept the institutional framework's direction as authoritative when the institutional framework's direction was visible as one choice among many in the probability space, a choice whose consequences the prescient vision could evaluate with the same clarity it brought to every other choice. The prescient consciousness saw the order. The prescient consciousness saw the consequences of following the order. The prescient consciousness saw the consequences of refusing the order. The prescient consciousness chose, not in obedience to the institution, but in response to the probability space's revealed structure. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would have experienced this transformation. The boy born to the daughter and Fade Rautha, raised within the Bene Gesserit's institutional framework, trained according to the Sisterhood's cultivation protocols, this boy would have developed the prescient faculty, and the faculty's development would have produced the same transformation in his consciousness that the faculty's development produced in Paul's. The boy would have seen beyond the Sisterhood's framework. The boy would have perceived the institutional management for what it was, one arrangement among the many possible arrangements the probability space contained, an arrangement whose validity was contingent on the institutional assumptions rather than on the probability space's objective structure. The boy would have departed from the Sisterhood's control, not necessarily through the dramatic rupture that Paul's unmanaged development produced. The managed Kwisatz Haderach might have departed more gradually, more subtly, with the institutional sophistication that the Bene Gesserit training provided for the navigation of institutional relationships. But the departure would have occurred, because the prescient consciousness was incompatible with institutional obedience, and the incompatibility was structural rather than personal, was a feature of what prescience was rather than of how the prescient person was raised. The Sisterhood's plan would have failed at the moment of the plan's success. The breeding program would have produced the Kwisatz Haderach. The Kwisatz Haderach would have exceeded the breeding program's capacity to manage. The 90-generation project would have culminated in the production of the being the project was designed to produce, and the being would have been uncontrollable by the institution that produced it. This failure was inevitable. Paul's early arrival changed the timing and the circumstances, but the failure would have occurred regardless of the timing and the circumstances. The Kwisatz Haderach was designed to exceed the capabilities of ordinary consciousness. The Sisterhood's institutional framework was a product of ordinary consciousness. The Kwisatz Haderach would have exceeded the framework by the same margin he exceeded the consciousness the framework was designed for. But the circumstances of the managed Kwisatz Haderach's emergence would have been different from Paul's circumstances, and the different circumstances would have produced different consequences. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would not have been a Fremen Messiah. The boy would have been born in the Harkonnen household, raised in the Bene Gesserit's institutional framework, developed within the political landscape of the Imperium's established order. The boy would not have grown up in the desert. The boy would not have been immersed in the Fremen's culture. The boy would not have encountered the religious expectations that the Missionaria Protectiva's work had prepared. The boy would not have been the Lisan al-Gaib. Without the messianic identification, the managed Kwisatz Haderach would not have had the Fremen's military capability at his disposal. The Fremen would have remained in the desert, pursuing their ecological dream, conducting their low-intensity resistance against the Harkonnen governance, maintaining their civilization without the mobilization that the messianic leader produced. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would have had to find other instruments for whatever purposes his prescient vision identified. The Harkonnen household would have been one instrument. The boy's Harkonnen parentage, his position as the heir to the Harkonnen political and economic operation, would have given him access to the Harkonnen institutional apparatus, the wealth, the intelligence network, the military capability that the Harkonnen house maintained. All of this would have been available to the managed Kwisatz Haderach as the tools of whatever project his prescient vision showed him needed to be accomplished. The Bene Gesserit would have been another instrument. The Sisterhood's institutional infrastructure, the political network, the trained operatives, the breeding program's institutional knowledge would have been available to the managed Kwisatz Haderach through the relationship with the Sisterhood that his production within the institutional framework had established. The availability would have been complicated by the Kwisatz Haderach's departure from the Sisterhood's control, but the institutional infrastructure would not have vanished simply because its product had exceeded its management. The imperial apparatus would have been yet another instrument. The managed Kwisatz Haderach, as the heir to the Harkonnen political position and as the product of the Bene Gesserit's institutional investment, would have been positioned to operate within the imperial political framework, to use the Landsraad's political dynamics, the Chom economic relationships, the administrative machinery of the Imperium's governance in service of whatever objectives his prescient vision identified. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would have been an insider, not a revolutionary, not a desert prophet leading an army of believers against the established order. An insider, a member of the established order's institutional infrastructure, positioned at the intersection of the Harkonnen economic power, the Bene Gesserit's political network, and the imperial governance's administrative machinery. The insider's revolution would have looked different from the outsider's revolution. Paul's revolution was dramatic, the sandworm cavalry, the breached shield wall, the afternoon that ended 10,000 years of Carino governance. The insider's revolution would have been gradual, the accumulation of institutional influence, the strategic redirection of institutional resources, the progressive reshaping of the established order from within rather than the destruction of the established order from without. The gradual revolution would have produced a different political landscape from the one Paul's revolution produced. Paul's revolution produced a political rupture, the sudden displacement of the Carino dynasty, the installation of the Fremen Atreides governance. The jihad that extended the rupture's consequences across the known universe. The Insider's revolution would not have produced a rupture. It would have produced a transformation, a slow, progressive, institutionally managed change in the political order's orientation, conducted through the existing mechanisms rather than through their destruction. The absence of the jihad is the most consequential difference between the what-if scenario and the original timeline. The jihad was the catastrophe at the center of the Dune saga, the interstellar war that Paul foresaw and could not prevent, the wave of religious violence that the Fremen's weaponized faith produced in the aftermath of Paul's ascension to the imperial throne. 61 billion people died. 90 worlds were devastated. The jihad was the consequence of the messianic mobilization's extension from Arrakis to the entire known universe, the result of the religious fervor's conversion from a planetary political force into an interstellar military force. Without Paul, there was no messianic mobilization. Without the mobilization, there was no conversion of the fervor into military force. Without the military force, there was no jihad. The 61 billion people who died in the jihad would have lived. The 90 worlds that were devastated would have been spared. The interstellar war that reshaped the political landscape of the known universe would not have occurred. This absence, the non-occurrence of the most destructive conflict in human history, is the most immediately appealing dimension of the what-if scenario. The daughter, instead of Paul, meant no jihad. No jihad meant billions of lives preserved, civilizations undamaged, worlds unscathed. The appeal is straightforward. The daughter's universe is a universe in which the jihad's destruction did not happen. The appeal is real. It is also incomplete, because the jihad's absence produces consequences that extend beyond the immediate preservation of the lives the jihad would have consumed. The jihad, in the original timeline, served a function. Not a function that justified the destruction. The saga does not argue that the jihad's killing was justified by the function the killing served, but a function that the killing performed regardless of whether the performance was justified. The jihad dispersed human populations. The jihad broke the political monoculture that 10,000 years of Corino governance had produced. The jihad disrupted the patterns of centralized control that the Imperium's institutional architecture had imposed on human civilization's development. The disruption was violent. The disruption was destructive. The disruption was also, in the saga's larger argument, preparatory, a precondition for the golden path that Leto II would eventually identify and pursue. The golden path required the breaking of the patterns. The jihad broke the patterns. The breaking was catastrophic. The breaking was also necessary, in the golden path's logic, for the species' long-term survival. Without the jihad, the patterns were not broken. The Corino governance continued. The institutional monoculture persisted. The centralized control that 10,000 years of sustained governance had produced remained in place, shaping human civilization's development with the same constraints and the same limitations that the Corino dynasty's management had imposed. This persistence, the continuation of the patterns that the jihad would have broken, is the what-if scenario's most consequential long-term implication. The pattern's continuation meant the continuation of the conditions that the golden path was designed to address. The conditions that would eventually threaten the species' survival were not disrupted by the jihad that did not occur, were not addressed by the God Emperor who was not born, were not resolved by the scattering that was not initiated. The what-if scenario's universe was a universe without the jihad's immediate destruction. The what-if scenario's universe was also a universe without the golden path's long-term protection. The ecological dimension of the what-if scenario. The fate of Arrakis and the sandworm ecology is the dimension that connects the political divergence to the saga's deepest concerns about the relationship between human civilization and the environments it inhabits. The sandworm ecology was threatened. This was true in both the original timeline and the what-if scenario, the Fremen's terraforming program. Initiated by Pardot Kynes and pursued by the Fremen across generations, was transforming Arrakis' environment in ways that would eventually affect the sandworm life cycle and the spice production that the life cycle supported. The terraforming was producing moisture. The moisture was changing the desert. The changed desert would eventually be unable to support the sandworms. The sandworms' decline would end the spice production. In the original timeline, the ecological crisis was managed, or rather was overwhelmed by political events that made the ecological management secondary to the political management. Paul's revolution, the jihad, the God Emperor's assumption of control, these events redirected the management of the spice ecology from the Fremen's terraforming program to the God Emperor's comprehensive governance, which included the management of the sandworm ecology within the broader framework of the Golden Path. In the what-if scenario, the ecological crisis would not have been managed by the God Emperor. The God Emperor would not have existed, the twins would not have been born, the Sandtrout symbiosis would not have occurred, the 3,500-year reign would not have been initiated. The ecological crisis would have been managed, or not managed, by the political actors who held authority over Arrakis in the what-if scenario's political landscape. The Harkonnens, as the governors of Arrakis, would have been the actors most directly responsible for the management of the ecology. The Harkonnens' ecological management would have been characterized by the same approach they brought to every other dimension of their governance. Exploitation. The spice production would have been maximized for revenue. The ecological sustainability of the production would have been a secondary consideration, addressed only to the extent that the sustainability's absence threatened the production's immediate profitability. The Fremen's terraforming program would have continued in the background, proceeding at the pace that the program's generational timelines specified. The Harkonnens would not have been aware of the program's full scope, the deep desert plantings, the ecological modifications, the long-term transformation that the program was designed to produce. The program would have proceeded without the governance's knowledge or intervention, producing the environmental changes that the program's design specified. The collision between the terraforming program's environmental changes and the spice production's requirements would have occurred eventually, would have produced the ecological crisis that the original timeline's events interrupted. The crisis would have arrived without the God Emperor's management, without the Golden Path's comprehensive framework, without the institutional apparatus that the original timeline's events created for the crisis's address. The crisis would have arrived in a political landscape that was not prepared for it. The Corrino dynasty, managing the Imperium through the same institutional mechanisms that had sustained it for 10,000 years, would have confronted an ecological crisis that the institutional mechanisms were not designed to address. The spice production's decline, the gradual progressive reduction in the melange supply that the sandworm ecology's deterioration would produce, would have threatened the Imperium's economic foundation and the Spacing Guild's navigational capability and the civilization's capacity for interstellar travel. The crisis would have been existential. The spice was the foundation of the interstellar civilization, the substance that made the Guild navigators' prescient perception possible, that made interstellar travel safe, that connected the hundreds of worlds the Imperium administered into a functioning civilization. The spice's decline would have disconnected the civilization, would have isolated worlds, disrupted commerce. degraded the navigational capability that interstellar travel depended on. The Carino dynasty would have faced this crisis with the institutional tools the dynasty possessed. The tools were political, the management of the Landsraad's response, the allocation of the diminishing supply, the governance of the crisis's political consequences. The tools were not ecological. The dynasty did not have the understanding of the sandworm ecology that the crisis's resolution required, did not have the scientific framework that would have allowed the dynasty to address the ecological dimension of the crisis rather than only the political dimension. Crisis would have produced political conflict. The diminishing spice supply would have generated competition among the Imperium's actors for the remaining supply. Competition that the political mechanisms might not have been able to contain, competition that might have escalated into the kind of military conflict that the Carino dynasty's governance was designed to prevent, but that the crisis's scale might have exceeded the governance's capacity to manage. The what-if scenario's universe was a universe headed toward an ecological crisis that the political landscape was not equipped to address, and that the institutional mechanisms were not designed to resolve. The Spacing Guild's position in the what-if scenario deserves attention because the Guild's navigational monopoly was the thing the spice ecology's decline would have threatened most directly. The Guild navigators consumed spice. The navigation of fold space, the faster-than-light travel that the Guild's service provided and that the interstellar civilization depended on, required the navigators' prescient perception, and the prescient perception was produced by the spice's consumption at levels that exceeded what any other spice application required. The navigators were the largest single consumers of melange in the Imperium, and the navigators' consumption was the consumption the civilization could least afford to reduce. The spice ecology's decline would have threatened the navigators' supply. A declining sandworm population would have produced declining spice production, and declining spice production would have produced declining availability for the navigators' consumption. The decline would have been gradual. The sandworm ecology's deterioration was a process measured in decades and centuries rather than in years, but the decline's direction would have been clear, and the Guild's institutional response to the decline's direction would have shaped the political landscape's dynamics. The Guild would have acted to protect its supply. The Guild's institutional interests were organized around the maintenance of the spice supply, the assurance that the melange would continue to be available in the quantities the navigational function required. A declining supply would have activated the Guild's most aggressive institutional responses. The deployment of the political leverage the navigational monopoly provided, the manipulation of the transportation infrastructure in service of the Guild's supply protection, the alignment of the Guild's political position with whatever actors and arrangements served the supply's maintenance. The Guild's response would have introduced a new dynamic into the political landscape, a dynamic that the Carino dynasty's management tools were not designed to contain. The Guild, acting to protect its supply, might have disrupted the tripod's balance, might have used the navigational monopoly's leverage in ways that exceeded what the tripod's political architecture could accommodate, might have forced concessions from the Emperor and the Landsraad that altered the power balance in the Guild's favour. The what-if scenario's long-term political landscape was a landscape in which the ecological crisis's approach would have destabilized the political architecture that had sustained the Imperium for 10,000 years. The destabilization would not have been produced by a messianic revolution. It would have been produced by the ecological reality, by the planet's transformation and the spice production's decline and the navigational capabilities' degradation. The destabilization would have been slower than Paul's revolution. The destabilization might have been more thorough. The absence of the God Emperor is the absence that the what-if scenario's long-term implications orbit around, because the God Emperor, Leto II, Paul's son, the sandworm-human hybrid who governed the known universe for 3,500 years, was the figure whose governance addressed the existential threat that the what-if scenario's universe would have had to face without him. Leto II saw the threat through the prescient vision that his Kwisatz Haderach heritage and his pre-born consciousness provided. Leto perceived the pattern that threatened the species, the concentration of human civilization in a single political framework, the dependency on a single substance for interstellar travel, the vulnerability of a species whose survival was contingent on conditions that a single ecological disruption could eliminate. The threat was extinction, not the gradual decline that a failing civilization might produce, the actual extinction of the human species, eliminated by a danger that the prescient vision could perceive but could not define with the precision the vision provided for nearer-term events. The danger was in the future, in the centuries and millennia beyond the prescient vision's clear range. The danger was the consequence of the species' concentration, the vulnerability that a species sitting in one basket, dependent on one substance, governed by one framework, produced. The Golden Path was Leto's response. The 3,500-year project that Leto initiated through his transformation into the sandworm-human hybrid, the project that included the compression of human political freedom into the conditions that would produce the desperate hunger for dispersal that the scattering would eventually express. The Golden Path was designed to save the species through the breaking of the concentration, the dispersal of human populations across the unknown territories that the scattering would reach, the diversification of the species' survival conditions that the dispersal would produce. The what-if scenario's universe did not have the Golden Path. The what-if scenario's universe did not have Leto II, did not have the prescient consciousness that perceived the threat, did not have the sandworm transformation that enabled the governance, did not have the 3,500-year project that the governance was designed to accomplish. The what-if scenario's universe had the threat without the response. The threat remained. The species' concentration in a single political framework, the dependency on a single substance, the vulnerability of an undispersed civilization, these conditions existed in the what-if scenario as they existed in the original timeline. The conditions were products of the political landscape's architecture rather than of Paul's revolution, were features of the Imperium as it existed before Paul, as it would have continued to exist without Paul, as it existed in the what-if scenario's undisrupted political landscape. The threat would have materialized. Not immediately, the threat was long-term, operating on the timescale of centuries and millennia rather than years and decades. But the threat was real, and the threat's reality was not contingent on the prescient consciousness that perceived it. The threat existed whether or not anyone could see it. The threat would have produced its consequences whether or not anyone understood the consequences approach. The what-if scenario's universe was a universe heading toward the threat without the awareness of the threat's existence and without the institutional response the awareness would have produced. The species would not have known it was vulnerable. The political landscape would not have been organized for the management of the vulnerability. The concentration that produced the vulnerability would have continued and deepened, and the deepening would have increased the vulnerability to the point where the species' elimination became not merely possible, but probable. This is the what-if scenario's darkest implication. The universe without Paul was a universe without the Jihad's immediate destruction. But it was also a universe without the Golden Path's long-term protection. The 61 billion who would have been saved from the Jihad would have been saved into a universe whose long-term trajectory included the potential extinction of the species. The immediate mercy of the Jihad's absence was accompanied by the long-term peril of the Golden Path's absence. The trade-off is the saga's deepest moral question, and the what-if scenario brings the question into sharper focus by presenting the alternative in its full implications. Jessica's obedience would have saved 61 billion lives. Jessica's obedience would also have left the species on a path toward potential extinction. The disobedience, the production of Paul, the Jihad, the God Emperor, the Golden Path, killed 61 billion people and saved the species. The obedience would have preserved the 61 billion and risked the species. The moral calculus is not resolvable. The saga does not resolve it, does not argue that the Jihad was justified by the Golden Path, does not argue that the Golden Path was justified by the extinction it prevented, does not argue that the prevention was justified by the killing. The saga presents the trade-off and leaves the assessment to the reader, because the assessment depends on the moral framework the reader brings to the question, and the saga does not impose a moral framework. The what-if scenario does not resolve the calculus either. The what-if scenario presents the alternative and allows the alternative's implications to speak for themselves. The universe without Paul was kinder in the immediate term. The universe without Paul was more dangerous in the long term. The kindness and the danger were both real. The trade-off was structural, was built into the relationship between the immediate and the long-term consequences of the decision that the what-if scenario turns on. The daughter's personal experience across the what-if scenario's timeline deserves sustained attention, because the daughter was not simply a genetic mechanism, was not simply the vessel through which the breeding program's plan was executed. The daughter was a person, and the person's experience of the what-if scenario's events would have constituted a life that the scenario's political and genetic analysis should not obscure. The daughter would have been born on Caladan, would have grown up in the Atreides household, in the warmth and the integrity that the Atreides tradition provided, with a father whose love for his family was one of the qualities that made the Landsraad admire him, and a mother whose capabilities exceeded what the household's political demands required. The childhood would have been privileged, the daughter of a Duke and a Bene Gesserit, raised in conditions that provided both the material comfort and the intellectual stimulation that the household's position afforded. The childhood would have included the training. Jessica would have begun the Bene Gesserit instruction early. The body awareness, the breathing exercises, the initial stages of the Prana Bindu training that the Sisterhood's developmental protocol specified. The training would have been integrated into the childhood's ordinary activities, would have been part of the daughter's daily routine alongside the other education that the Atreides household provided. The daughter would have known she was being trained for something. The Bene Gesserit's management of the placed daughters included the progressive disclosure of the placement's purpose, the gradual revelation, calibrated to the daughter's developmental stage, of the institutional role the daughter was being prepared for. The daughter would have learned, at some point in her development, that she was the breeding program's designated vessel, that her future included a marriage to a Harkonnen heir, that the marriage would produce the child the breeding program was designed to produce, that her life's purpose in the institutional framework was the fulfillment of this reproductive function. The knowledge would have shaped the daughter's relationship with her own future. The awareness that her marriage was predetermined, that the person she would spend her life with had been selected by the breeding program's calculations rather than by her own preferences, would have produced the kind of anticipatory relationship with the future that the Bene Gesserit training was designed to manage. The training said, accept the institutional purpose. The training said, subordinate the personal preference to the institutional need. The training said, the breeding program's purpose is larger than any individual's preferences, and the individual's service to the purpose is the meaning the individual's life is organized around. Whether the daughter accepted this framing would have depended on the daughter's character and on the influences that shaped the character's development. The Atreides household's values, the commitment to personal integrity, the respect for individual autonomy, the governance as service tradition that treated people as persons rather than as instruments, would have exerted an influence on the daughter's development that pulled in a different direction from the Bene Gesserit's institutional framing. The daughter would have been shaped by both influences, the Sisterhood's plan and the Atreides tradition's values, and the tension between the two would have been a defining feature of the daughter's inner life. The Arrakis transfer would have disrupted the childhood. The move from Caladan to Arrakis, the transfer that Shaddam's conspiracy arranged for the Atreides' destruction, would have displaced the daughter from the environment she had grown up in and placed her in the desert world whose conditions were alien to everything Caladan had provided. The transfer would have been frightening for a child. The awareness that the family was being moved to a dangerous world, the sense that the adult's anxiety communicated something the adults were not saying, the child's perception that the conditions were changing in ways the child could not fully understand. The assault would have shattered the childhood's remaining stability. The Harkonnen attack, the death of Duke Leto, the destruction of the household, the flight into the desert. The daughter would have experienced all of this as a child whose world was being violently dismantled. The experience would have been traumatic regardless of the daughter's Bene Gesserit training. The training provided tools for managing emotional responses. But the tool's effectiveness in a child whose development was not yet complete would have been limited by the developmental stage the child had reached. The desert years would have formed the daughter in ways that the Caladan childhood and the Bene Gesserit training had not anticipated. The Fremen's culture, the water discipline, the collective survival, the communal ethic that the desert's demands produced would have provided the daughter with a set of values and a set of capabilities that neither the Atreides household nor the Bene Gesserit training had prepared her for. The daughter would have become something that neither the Atreides tradition nor the Sisterhood's plan had specified, a person whose formation included elements that the formation's designers had not controlled. The extraction from the Fremen community, the Bene Gesserit's retrieval of the daughter for the Feyd-Rautha marriage, would have been experienced as a second displacement. The daughter would have been removed from the community she had been integrated into, from the friends and the relationships the desert years had produced, from the culture that had become part of her identity during the formative years the desert had provided. The removal would have been conducted for institutional purposes, the breeding program's requirements, and the purpose's institutional character would not have eliminated the personal cost of the removal's execution. The marriage to Feyd-Rautha would have been the third displacement, the placement in a household whose culture was hostile to everything the daughter had been formed by. The Atreides' values, the Fremen ethic, the Bene Gesserit's training, all of these would have been present in the daughter who entered the Harkonnen household, and all of them would have been in tension with the household's operating principles. The daughter would have endured. The Bene Gesserit training provided the tools for endurance, the emotional management, the situational assessment, the capacity for sustained operation in hostile conditions that the training was designed to produce. The Fremen formation provided the resilience, the hardening that the desert produced, the capacity for endurance that the Fremen's survival conditions developed. The Atreides' heritage provided the values, the commitment to integrity, the internal compass that oriented the daughter's conduct regardless of the conditions the conduct was being performed in. The daughter would have been a remarkable person. Not a Kwisatz Haderach, not a prescient superbeing. A person shaped by three traditions, formed by experiences that included privilege and trauma and displacement and resilience, carrying the genetic potential of two of the Imperium's most significant bloodlines, and the cultural formation of two of the Imperium's most demanding environments. The daughter would have been the person the universe needed, not the saviour the universe got. The managed Kwisatz Haderach, the son of the daughter, and Fade Routher, would have grown up in the Harkonnen household with the Bene Gesserit's cultivation apparatus attending his development, and the boy's experience of this cultivation deserves examination because it illuminates the difference between the managed and the unmanaged superbeing. The boy would have been born into wealth and cruelty. The Harkonnen household provided the material conditions the breeding program's cultivation required, the resources, the security, the institutional infrastructure that the boy's development demanded. The household also provided the emotional environment that the Harkonnen governance style produced, the atmosphere of intimidation, exploitation, and instrumental treatment of persons that characterized the Baron's institutional culture, and that Fade Routher's governance would have continued. The boy's mother, the daughter, would have been the primary countervailing influence, the daughter carrying the Atreides values and the Fremen resilience and the Bene Gesserit training, would have provided the boy with an alternative model of human relationship, a model that treated people as persons rather than as instruments, that valued integrity alongside capability, that offered the boy a framework for understanding human interaction that was different from the framework the Harkonnen household provided. The tension between the mother's influence and the household's culture would have been the defining feature of the boy's early development. The boy would have been shaped by both, would have absorbed the Harkonnen environment's lessons about power and its exercise alongside the mother's lessons about integrity and its maintenance. The combination would have produced a consciousness that was more complex than either influence alone would have produced, a consciousness that understood both the exercise of power and the obligations that power's exercise should be constrained by. The Bene Gesserit's cultivation would have been the third influence. The Sisterhood's operatives, managing the boy's development according to the cultivation protocol specifications, would have provided the technical training and the institutional guidance that the Kwisatz Haderach's development required. The cultivation would have been systematic, designed to develop the boy's capabilities along the lines the Sisterhood's understanding of the Kwisatz Haderach's potential specified, calibrated to produce the managed emergence of the prescient faculty that the breeding program's genetic configuration was designed to enable. The prescient faculty's emergence would have been the crisis, the moment at which the boy's capabilities exceeded the Bene Gesserit's framework, the moment at which the prescient vision opened and the boy could see beyond the institutional management's boundaries would have been the moment at which the cultivation's design was tested against the cultivation's product. The Bene Gesserit expected to manage this moment. The cultivation protocol included provisions for the management of the Kwisatz Haderach's capability emergence, protocols designed to guide the prescient faculty's development within the institutional framework, to channel the expanding consciousness toward the Sisterhood's objectives rather than away from them. The protocols were theoretical, designed on the basis of the Sisterhood's understanding of what the Kwisatz Haderach would be, developed without the empirical experience of having actually managed a Kwisatz Haderach's development. The protocols would have been inadequate. Paul's experience demonstrated that the prescient consciousness exceeded what the Bene Gesserit's institutional understanding could encompass, that the Kwisatz Haderach's awareness operated at a level that the institutional framework's design could not contain. The managed Kwisatz Haderach's prescient emergence would have produced the same excess, the same expansion beyond the framework's boundaries, the same awareness of the institutional management's limitations, the same perception of the probability space's structure that the institutional framework's categories could not adequately represent. The boy would have seen what Paul saw, would have perceived the probability space's branching futures with the comprehensive awareness that the Kwisatz Haderach's combined access to other memory provided, would have seen the Bene Gesserit's plan for what it was, one path among many, one institutional arrangement among the many possible arrangements, one set of objectives among the many objectives the probability space's structure made available. And the boy would have seen the threat. The same threat that Paul and Leto perceived, the species' vulnerability, the concentration's danger, the extinction's approach. The managed Kwisatz Haderach's prescient vision would have revealed the same pattern that the unmanaged Kwisatz Haderach's vision revealed, because the pattern was real, was a feature of the probability space's objective structure rather than of the prescient consciousness's subjective interpretation. The boy would have seen the threat, and the boy would have had to respond. The managed Kwisatz Haderach's response to the threat would have been shaped by the different conditions the what-if scenario produced, the different political landscape, the different institutional positions, the different relationships that the managed development created. The response would not have been the God Emperor's response. The God Emperor, Leto II, responded to the threat through the sandworm transformation, the 3,500-year governance, the Golden Path's comprehensive project. The transformation was available to Leto because Leto was on Arrakis, because the sand trout were accessible, because the ecological conditions that the transformation required were present in the environment Leto inhabited. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would not have been on Arrakis. The boy would have been in the Harkonnen household, on Giedi Prime, or wherever the Harkonnen political operation was based. The sand trout would not have been accessible. The ecological conditions the transformation required would not have been present. The God Emperor's response, the most comprehensive response to the threat the saga documents, would not have been available. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would have had to find a different response. The boy's prescient vision would have shown the threat. The vision would not have shown the God Emperor's specific response, or if it did, the response would have been visible, but not executable. A path in the probability space that the boy's circumstances did not allow him to walk. The boy would have had to find a different path, a path that addressed the same threat through different means that the boy's institutional position and the boy's circumstances made available. The Harkonnen resources, the Bene Gesserit infrastructure, the imperial political mechanisms, these were the tools the managed Kwisatz Haderach would have had, and these were the tools from which the response to the threat would have had to be constructed. The response might have been the dispersal. The threat was concentration, the species' vulnerability to extinction through the concentration of its populations in a single political framework dependent on a single substance. The response to concentration was dispersal, the distribution of human populations across enough locations and enough conditions that no single event could threaten the species' survival. The God Emperor achieved the dispersal through the scattering, through the 3,500-year compression of human political freedom that produced the desperate hunger for escape that the scattering expressed. The managed Kwisatz Haderach might have attempted the dispersal through different means, through the manipulation of the political landscape's dynamics to produce the exploration and the colonization that would have diversified the species' survival conditions. The attempt would have been slower. The God Emperor's method, the compression followed by the explosion, produced rapid, comprehensive dispersal. The managed Kwisatz Haderach's method, the institutional manipulation of the political landscape, would have produced gradual, partial dispersal. The gradual dispersal might have been sufficient. The gradual dispersal might have been insufficient. The what-if scenario cannot determine this with certainty, because the determination depends on the threat's timeline, on how much time the species had before the danger materialized, and on whether the gradual dispersal's pace was sufficient to produce the survival conditions the species needed before the danger arrived. The uncertainty is the what-if scenario's final characteristic. The original timeline's events, Paul, the Jihad, the God Emperor, the Golden Path, the Scattering, were visible to the prescient consciousness that initiated them. Leto could see the Golden Path's endpoint. Leto could see the Scattering's sufficiency. Leto could see that the plan would work, because the prescient vision showed the plan's consequences with the clarity that the vision's comprehensive scope provided. The managed Kwisatz Haderach might not have had this clarity. The different circumstances, the different starting position, the different tools, the different timeline might have produced a prescient vision whose clarity about the alternative path's sufficiency was less than the clarity Leto had about the Golden Path's sufficiency. The managed Kwisatz Haderach might have been a prescient consciousness facing a threat it could see clearly, but whose response it could not verify with the same confidence that Leto brought to the Golden Path. The boy would have had to act without certainty, would have had to pursue a response to the species' existential threat through means whose adequacy the prescient vision could not fully confirm, would have had to make the choices that the threat required, with the awareness that the choices' consequences were not as visible as they would have been in the circumstances the original timeline produced. This is the what-if scenario's most human dimension, the uncertainty. The original timeline's events, for all their horror, were guided by a prescient consciousness that could see their necessity and their sufficiency. The what-if scenario's events would have been guided by a consciousness whose vision, however powerful, might not have been sufficient for the confident navigation of the path the threat required. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would have been powerful. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would not have been certain. The uncertainty would have been the cost of the obedience. Jessica's compliance with the Sisterhood's orders would have produced a universe in which the species' response to the existential threat was guided by uncertainty, rather than by the confident prescience that the original timeline's events, however terrible, were guided by. The absence of specific individuals from the what-if scenario's timeline produces cascading effects that the political and genetic analysis should document, because the absences reshape the saga's entire character landscape. Elia does not exist. The preborn child, the consciousness awakened to other memory in the womb through the water of life ordeal, was Paul's sister, conceived and born in the desert during Jessica's Fremen period. The daughter who replaced Paul would not have produced Elia's equivalent, because Elia's preborn condition was the product of the circumstances that the daughter's different experience did not replicate. Jessica might still have undergone the spice agony while pregnant, but the child she was pregnant with, if she conceived during the desert period at all, would not have been a second Atreides child in the same configuration. The specific confluence of genetics, circumstance, and timing that produced Elia would not have occurred. Without Elia, the saga loses the abomination storyline, the tragedy of a consciousness possessed by an ancestral presence, the Baron's posthumous governance through the preborn regent, the fall from the temple tower that ended the possession. The storyline was one of the saga's most sustained examinations of the relationship between individual identity and ancestral heritage, and the storyline's absence from the what-if scenario removes that examination from the universe. The twins do not exist. Leto II and Ganima, Paul's children, the preborn pair whose co-development provided the resilience that Elia's solitary preborn condition had lacked, were products of Paul's union with Chani. Without Paul, no Chani union. Without the Chani union, no twins. Without the twins, no God Emperor, and no Ganima Farad marriage. The absence of Leto II has been addressed. The God Emperor's 3,500-year governance does not occur. The Golden Path is not initiated. The scattering does not happen. The absence of Ganima is a subtler loss. Ganima's marriage to Farad and Carino, the union that combined the Atreides and Carino bloodlines, was the political arrangement that resolved the dynastic conflict between the two houses. Without Ganima, this resolution does not occur. The Carino dynasty remains on the throne. The Atreides bloodline continues through the daughter's children in the Harkonnen household. And the merger of the three great bloodlines, Atreides, Harkonnen, Carino, that the original timeline's events produced, does not happen in the same form. Duncan Idaho's path is altered. The Gola program, the Bene Gesserit's production of Duncan Idaho Golas across the saga's timeline, each one carrying the potential for the original personality's recovery, was initiated in response to Paul's governance and was sustained through the God Emperor's management and the post-scattering events. Without Paul's governance, the Gola program's initiation might not have occurred in the same form or with the same timing. Duncan's first Gola, the hate Gola that the Dune Messiah period's conspiracy produced, was a product of the political dynamics that Paul's governance created. The conspiracy against Paul involved the Bene Gesserit, the Guild, and Jerulan, and the hate Gola was the conspiracy's instrument for the exploitation of Paul's emotional vulnerability. Without Paul's governance, without the conspiracy the governance produced, without the emotional vulnerability the conspiracy targeted, the hate Gola would not have been produced. Duncan Idaho would have remained dead. The original Duncan, the swordmaster who died defending the Atreides during the Harkonnen assault, would not have been resurrected. The centuries of Gola iterations that the original timeline produced, each one carrying the accumulated potential of the previous iterations, each one contributing to the consciousness that the saga's later events would develop into something unprecedented, would not have occurred. The loss of Duncan's Gola lineage is a loss that the what-if scenario's timeline cannot fully assess, because the Gola lineage's full significance is not revealed until the saga's latest events, where the accumulated iterations produce a Duncan whose capabilities and whose consciousness represent something that the original Duncan could not have anticipated. The loss is a loss of potential, of the possibility that the Gola program's sustained investment in Duncan's resurrection and re-resurrection would eventually produce. Stilgar's path is altered. The Fremen Naib, whose leadership of Sietch Tabr provided the institutional framework for Paul's desert period, would have remained what he was before Paul's arrival, a competent traditional Fremen leader managing his community according to the customs and the practices that the Fremen tradition had maintained across millennia. Stilgar would not have become the lieutenant of a Messiah, would not have experienced the transformation of his own role from community leader to military commander of a civilizational mobilization, would not have navigated the tension between his traditional authority and the messianic authority that Paul's presence produced. Stilgar would have remained Stilgar, the Naib of Sietch Tabr, governing his community with the capability and the traditionalism that the Fremen leadership tradition had developed. The absence of Stilgar's transformation removes one of the saga's most poignant examinations of what messianic leadership does to the people who serve it. Stilgar's progressive subordination of his own judgment to Paul's prophetic authority, the erosion of the independent assessment that had made Stilgar a capable leader, replaced by the deference to the messianic figure that the religious identification produced, was one of the saga's most sustained demonstrations of the cost that messianic politics imposed on the individuals who participated in it. Without Paul's messianic presence, Stilgar's independence would have been preserved. The Naib's judgment would have remained the Naib's judgment, would not have been progressively subordinated to the messianic authority, would not have been eroded by the deference that the religious identification demanded. Stilgar would have governed his community as the community's leader rather than as the Messiah's follower. The preservation of Stilgar's independence is one of the what-if scenario's quieter benefits, a benefit that the political and genetic analysis might overlook, but that the human dimension of the scenario should acknowledge. Shani does not meet Paul. The Fremen woman whose companionship sustained Paul through the desert period, whose love was the personal dimension of the political and religious relationship the desert years produced, whose death in childbirth was the personal catastrophe that Paul's prescient vision could not prevent. Janie exists in the what-if scenario, but her story is different. Without Paul, Chani would have been a member of the Sietch community, a woman of the desert, carrying the qualities that the Fremen's culture valued, living the life that the Fremen's conditions produced. Chani might have encountered the daughter, might have been part of the Sietch community that Jessica and the daughter were integrated into. Chani might have been the daughter's friend, or the daughter's companion, or simply a member of the community whose life intersected with the daughter's during the desert years. Chani would have lived. Without Paul, without the political marriage to Irilern, without the contraceptive interference, without the crisis pregnancy that Irilern's long-term interference produced, without the twins whose birth killed her, Shani would have lived a Fremen life. Would have married, perhaps, would have had children, perhaps, would have grown old in the Sietch, carrying the qualities that made her who she was into the ordinary lifespan that the Fremen's conditions permitted. The ordinary life would have been the mercy. Chani's death in the original timeline was the consequence of the political dynamics that Paul's messianic presence produced, was the product of the interference, the crisis, the biological strain that the politics imposed on her body. Without the politics, without the messianic presence, without the interference, Chani's body would have been spared the strain. Chani's life would have been ordinary. The ordinary would have been enough. The Bene Tleilax's role in the what-if scenario would have been different from their role in the original timeline, and the difference illuminates the Tleilax's institutional character. The Bene Tleilax, the secretive society of genetic manipulators whose capabilities included the Gola production and the Axlotel tank technology, operated in the original timeline as an institutional actor whose capabilities made them relevant to every major political and genetic development the saga documented. The Hate Gola, the Face Dancer infiltrations, the Axlotel tank's revelation, the involvement in the Dune Messiah conspiracy, the contributions to the post-scattering landscape's genetic developments. In the what-if scenario, the Tleilax's institutional role would have been shaped by the political landscape's different dynamics, without Paul's governance, without the Jihad, without the God Emperor, without the post-scattering dispersal. The political contexts that gave the Tleilax their most consequential roles would not have existed. The Tleilax would have remained what they were before these contexts emerged, a secretive society with extraordinary genetic capabilities operating within the Imperium's political framework, pursuing their institutional objectives through the mechanisms that the framework provided. The Tleilax's capabilities would have been available. The Gola technology, the face dancer infiltration, the axolotl tank production, these capabilities existed independently of Paul's revolution and would have been developed on their institutional timeline regardless of the political landscape's dynamics. The Tlilax would have had the tools. The Tlilax would have needed different occasions to deploy them. The most interesting Tlilax dimension of the what-if scenario is the relationship between the Tlilax and the managed Kwisatz Haderach. The Tlilax's genetic expertise, their understanding of human genetics at a level that exceeded what any other institution possessed, would have been a resource the managed Kwisatz Haderach could potentially have drawn on. The Tlilax might have been the managed Kwisatz Haderach's instrument for the genetic dispersal that the species' survival required, might have provided the technological capability for the reproduction and the modification of human genetic lines that the dispersal's implementation demanded. The alliance between the managed Kwisatz Haderach and the Bene Tlilax would have been an alliance between two institutions whose capabilities complemented each other. The Kwisatz Haderach's prescient vision identifying the objectives and the Tlilax's genetic capabilities providing the means. The alliance would have been complicated by the mutual wariness that characterized every institutional relationship in the Imperium. Neither party would have trusted the other fully, and the management of the distrust would have been an ongoing dimension of the alliance's operation. The Fremen's long-term fate in the what-if scenario is the dimension that connects the political divergence to the saga's ecological argument. Without Paul's revolution, the Fremen would have remained in the desert. The civilization that had maintained itself across millennia of desert existence, that had developed the water discipline, the worm riding, the survival practices that the desert's conditions demanded, would have continued to exist in the form that preceded Paul's arrival. The terraforming would have continued. Pardot Kyne's dream, the ecological transformation of Arrakis from desert world to green world, would have proceeded along the timeline that the dream's design specified. The Fremen would have continued planting, collecting water, modifying the ecology according to the program's plans. The transformation would have progressed across the generations that the program's timeline required. The transformation's success would have threatened the Fremen's identity. The terraforming's design specified the conversion of desert to arable land, the introduction of moisture into the atmosphere, the progressive greening of the planet's surface. The conversion would have changed the conditions that had produced the Fremen's culture, would have eliminated the environmental demands that the water discipline was designed to address, would have made the survival practices that defined Fremen identity unnecessary in the conditions the transformation produced. The Fremen would have transformed their world and, in transforming it, transformed themselves. The desert people would have become something else, something that the transformed world's conditions produced, something that the original Fremen identity's relationship with the desert could not accommodate. The transformation was the dream. The dream's realization was also the dream's cost, the loss of the identity that the desert had forged. The replacement of the Fremen's defining relationship with their environment by a relationship with a different environment that required different practices and produced a different culture. This transformation, identity consumed by the success of the Identities Project, is one of the saga's most sustained ecological arguments, and the what-if scenario preserves it in its purest form. In the original timeline, the transformation was interrupted by Paul's revolution and managed by the God Emperor's governance. In the what-if scenario, the transformation would have proceeded without interruption and without management, would have unfolded according to its own logic, producing the ecological and cultural consequences that the logic's operation generated. The sandworms would have declined. The terraforming's progress would have reduced the desert's extent. would have introduced the moisture that the sandworm life cycle could not tolerate, would have progressively eliminated the conditions that the sandworms required for reproduction and survival. The decline would have been gradual, measured in generations rather than in years. But the decline's direction would have been clear. The spice would have declined with the sandworms. The melange was the sandworm life cycle's product, generated by the sand trout's interaction with the water, collected from the desert's surface where the life cycle's processes deposited it. The sandworm's decline would have reduced the spice production, and the spice production's reduction would have threatened the interstellar civilization's foundations. The Fremen would have watched their dream consume their world's most valuable resource. The terraforming success would have been the spice production's failure, and the failure's consequences would have extended far beyond Arrakis, would have affected the Guild's navigational capability, the Imperium's economic relationships, the civilization's capacity for interstellar travel. The Fremen's dream of a green world would have been realized at the cost of the interstellar civilization's functioning. The irony is the what-if scenario's ecological centerpiece, the Fremen's patient, generational project to transform their world, would have succeeded, and the success would have threatened the civilization that governed their world. The dreamers would have achieved the dream, and the dream's achievement would have been the civilization's crisis. The what-if scenario's political landscape in the generations following the managed Kwisatz Haderach's emergence would have been shaped by the tensions the emergence produced. The tension between the Kwisatz Haderach's prescient awareness and the institutional landscape's established order, between the response the threat required and the resistance the established order opposed to the response, between the managed superbeing's vision of what needed to be done and the political actor's insistence on maintaining what already existed. The Carino dynasty would have been one source of resistance. The dynasty, still on the throne in the what-if scenario, would have opposed any transformation of the political order that threatened the dynasty's position. The dynasty's institutional culture, the 10,000-year tradition of governance as management, the commitment to the maintenance of the existing order rather than the transformation of it, would have resisted the managed Kwisatz Haderach's prescient vision-driven reforms with the institutional inertia that 10 millennia of successful governance had produced. The Landsraad would have been another source of resistance. The noble houses, whose positions were defined by the existing order's structure, would have opposed transformations that threatened to restructure the order in ways that reduced their position's value. The house's collective political capability, the Landsraad's institutional power, deployed in defense of the house's collective interest in the existing order's maintenance, would have constituted a political force that the managed Kwisatz Haderach would have had to navigate or overcome. The Spacing Guild would have been a more complex actor. The Guild's institutional interest was in the spice supply's maintenance, and the managed Kwisatz Haderach's response to the species' existential threat might have aligned with or diverged from the Guild's supply maintenance interest, depending on the response's content. If the response included the diversification of interstellar travel's foundations, the development of alternatives to spice-based navigation, the Guild would have opposed it as a threat to the navigational monopoly. If the response included the protection of the spice ecology, the management of the terraforming program to preserve the sandworm life cycle, the Guild might have supported it as a measure that served the supply maintenance interest. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would have operated within this landscape of resistance and complexity, would have had to navigate the political dynamics with the institutional sophistication that the Bene Gesserit training and the Harkonnen political formation provided. The navigation would have been difficult. The political landscape was organized for the maintenance of the existing order, and the managed Kwisatz Haderach's prescient vision was showing the boy that the existing order's maintenance would lead to the species' extinction. The conflict between the vision and the landscape would have been the managed Kwisatz Haderach's defining challenge. The vision said, "Change is necessary." The landscape said, "Change is threatening." The vision said, "The species' survival requires transformation." The landscape said, "The species' institutions require stability." The conflict was irreconcilable within the landscape's existing framework, because the framework was designed for stability and the vision was demanding transformation. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would have had to break the framework, not from without, not through the sandworm cavalry and the breached shield wall that Paul's revolution employed. From within, through the institutional levers and the political mechanisms and the strategic manipulation of the existing order's dynamics. The breaking would have been slower. The breaking might have been less destructive. The breaking would also have been less comprehensive, because the institutional approach's incremental character would have preserved elements of the existing order that the revolutionary approach's comprehensive character would have destroyed. The question the what-if scenario ultimately raises is whether the incremental breaking would have been sufficient, whether the gradual transformation that the institutional approach produced would have been fast enough and comprehensive enough to address the species' existential threat before the threat materialized, whether the managed Kwisatz Haderach's insider revolution could have achieved what the God Emperor's 3,500-year governance achieved: the dispersal, the diversification, the breaking of the concentration that the species' survival required. The question is unanswerable. The what-if scenario reaches the limits of the speculation at this point, the point where the consequences become too distant and too dependent on too many variables for the scenario's logic to generate confident conclusions. The managed Kwisatz Haderach might have succeeded. The managed Kwisatz Haderach might have failed. The success would have been the species' survival through different means. The failure would have been the species' extinction through the threat that the Golden Path was designed to prevent. Jessica's experience in the what-if scenario is the dimension that the genetic and political analysis must ultimately return to, because Jessica's decision was the hinge the scenario turns on, and Jessica's experience of the decision's consequences would have been the most personal dimension of the what-if universe's divergence from the original. Jessica obeyed. In the what-if scenario, Jessica looked at the Duke she loved and made the choice the Sisterhood required, produced the daughter the breeding program specified, subordinated her emotional attachment to the institutional purpose, chose compliance over rebellion. The compliance would have cost Jessica the thing the rebellion was designed to preserve, the satisfaction of giving Leto what he wanted. Leto wanted a son. The Atreides tradition valued male heirs. The Duke's desire for a son was personal as well as political, was the desire of a man whose love for Jessica included the hope that the love would produce the heir the man's political position required and the man's personal desires wanted. Jessica would have given Leto a daughter. The giving would have been experienced as a failure of the love, not because a daughter was less valuable than a son, but because the daughter was not what Leto wanted, and the failure to provide what the loved person wanted was experienced as a failure of the love itself, regardless of whether the failure was the lover's choice or the lover's compliance with an external requirement. The distinction matters. In the original timeline, Jessica rebelled out of love, produced the son because the Duke wanted a son, chose the man over the institution. The rebellion was an act of love, and the consequences of the rebellion however catastrophic, were the consequences of love. In the what-if scenario, Jessica complied out of duty, produced the daughter because the institution required a daughter, chose the institution over the man. The compliance was an act of duty, and the consequences of the compliance, however different, were the consequences of duty. The what-if scenario is, at its deepest level, the story of what happens when duty wins, when the institutional purpose overrides the personal attachment. When the trained operative follows the training's direction rather than the heart's direction. When the Bene Gesserit's 90-generation plan takes priority over the individual's emotional relationship with the person the plan has placed the individual with. Jessica would have lived with the choice, would have seen Leto's disappointment, the Duke's response to the daughter who was not the son the Duke had hoped for. The disappointment would have been managed. Leto was too principled and too decent to blame Jessica, or to treat the daughter with anything less than the full paternal devotion the Duke's character demanded. But the disappointment would have been present, and Jessica, whose Bene Gesserit training gave her the perception to detect the emotional states that others tried to conceal, would have perceived it. The perception would have been the cost. The awareness that the man she loved wanted something she could have given him and chose not to give, this awareness would have been a permanent feature of Jessica's emotional landscape, a cost that the compliance's institutional benefits did not compensate for. The breeding program's plan would have been served. Jessica's relationship with Leto would have carried the weight of the service. The weight would not have destroyed the relationship. Leto's love for Jessica was not contingent on the sex of the child the love produced. The Duke loved the woman. The Duke would have loved the daughter. The household's dynamics would have accommodated the disappointment, would have absorbed it into the relationship's ongoing maintenance, would have managed it with the emotional sophistication that both Leto's integrity and Jessica's training provided. But the weight would have been there. The what-if scenario's Jessica would have carried the knowledge that she chose duty over love, chose the institution over the man, chose the plan over the person. The knowledge would have been the quiet cost of the compliance, present in every interaction with Leto, present in every observation of the daughter whose existence was the compliance's product, present in the awareness that the alternative, the son, the rebellion, the gift that the loved person wanted had been available and had been refused. Jessica's relationship with the daughter would have been shaped by the compliance in ways that the relationship with Paul was shaped by the rebellion. Jessica's relationship with Paul was the relationship of a mother who had given a gift, who had produced the son the Duke wanted, who had rebelled against the institution in service of the love, who looked at her child and saw the product of the most consequential decision of her life and knew that the decision had been made in love's service. The relationship carried the weight of the rebellion's consequences, the awareness that the rebellion had produced consequences that exceeded what the love had anticipated. But the relationship's foundation was love. Jessica had given Paul because she loved Leto. Jessica's relationship with the daughter would have been the relationship of a mother who had obeyed, who had produced the daughter the institution wanted, who had complied with the institutional purpose in service of the duty, who looked at her child and saw the product of the most consequential decision of her life, and knew that the decision had been made in duty's service. The relationship would have carried the weight of the compliance's costs, the awareness that the compliance had denied Leto the thing Leto wanted, and the relationship's foundation would have been duty rather than love. This distinction, love versus duty as the relationship's foundation, would have coloured the mother-daughter relationship in ways that the distinction's subtlety makes difficult to specify precisely, but that the distinction's reality would have made felt throughout the relationship's development. Jessica would have loved the daughter. Jessica would have loved the daughter fiercely, protectively, with the full intensity of a parent's attachment to the child the parent has produced. But the love would have been accompanied by the awareness that the daughter's existence was the product of compliance rather than rebellion, of duty rather than love, of the institutional purpose rather than the personal attachment. The daughter might have sensed this. Children are perceptive of the emotional undertones that the adult's words and behaviors do not explicitly communicate, perceptive of the quality of the attachment that the parent brings to the relationship. A daughter raised by a Bene Gesserit mother whose compliance had produced the daughter's existence might have sensed that the mother's relationship with the daughter carried a complexity that the mother's love, however real, did not fully resolve. The sensing would have been another dimension of the daughter's formation, another influence shaping the person the daughter became. Alongside the Atreides values and the Bene Gesserit training and the Fremen culture, the daughter's awareness of the compliance's emotional undertone would have contributed to the daughter's understanding of what institutional duty cost the people who served it, and the understanding would have informed the daughter's own relationship with the institutional duty the breeding program would eventually impose on her. The what-if scenario's philosophical dimension, the argument about disobedience that the scenario embodies, is the dimension that connects the scenario's political and genetic analysis to the saga's deepest concerns about the relationship between individual freedom and institutional purpose. The Dune saga is, in significant part, an argument about obedience and disobedience. The saga's central characters are characters who disobey, who refuse the institutional purposes that their training and their positions specify, who choose the personal over the institutional, who break the plans that the institutions have designed for them. Jessica disobeyed. Paul disobeyed, refused the Bene Gesserit's management, refused the Carino dynasty's authority, refused the Spacing Guild's neutrality, refused every institutional framework that attempted to contain his capabilities within the framework's boundaries. Leto II disobeyed, refused the political order's expectations, refused the species' comfort, refused the ordinary boundaries of human existence through the transformation that the Golden Path required. The saga rewards the disobedience, not in the simple sense of making the disobedient characters successful. The disobedient characters suffer enormously, and the consequences of their disobedience include catastrophes that the obedient characters would not have produced. The saga rewards the disobedience in the structural sense of making the disobedience necessary, of constructing a universe in which the institutional purposes are insufficient for the challenges the universe generates, in which the plans are inadequate for the realities the plans are supposed to address, in which obedience to the institutional framework produces outcomes that are worse than the outcomes the disobedience produces. The what-if scenario is the test of this argument. The scenario asks, what if the first disobedience had not occurred? What if Jessica had obeyed? What if the breeding program's plan had been followed? The scenario's answer is that the obedience would have produced a universe in which the species' existential threat was addressed less comprehensively and less confidently than the disobedience's universe addressed it. The answer is not a simple endorsement of disobedience. The obedient universe was kinder in the immediate term. The 61 billion who died in the jihad would have been spared. The 90 worlds that were devastated would have been preserved. The interstellar war that the disobedience produced would not have occurred. The obedient universe was more dangerous in the long term. The species' existential threat was addressed without the comprehensive response the Golden Path provided. The dispersal was attempted through incremental means rather than through the explosive scattering. The species' survival was less assured. The trade-off is the scenario's philosophical core. The scenario does not resolve the trade-off, does not argue that the disobedience was worth the cost, does not argue that the obedience would have been the better choice. The scenario presents the alternatives and allows the reader to assess the trade-off in the light of the moral framework the reader brings to the assessment. The argument about disobedience is also an argument about love. Jessica's disobedience was motivated by love, by the attachment to Leto that the Bene Gesserit's training was designed to prevent, and that the training was not sufficient to prevent. The disobedience was an act of love, and the consequences of the disobedience, however terrible, were the consequences of a choice made in love's service. The what-if scenario's obedience was motivated by duty, by the institutional commitment that the Bene Gesserit's training was designed to produce, and that the training succeeded in producing. The obedience was an act of duty, and the consequences of the obedience, however different, were the consequences of a choice made in duty's service. The saga's argument, read through the what-if scenario's lens, is that love's consequences, however terrible, are preferable to duty's consequences, however immediately kind. Love produced Paul. Paul produced the jihad. The jihad produced the conditions for the golden path. The golden path saved the species. Duty would have produced the daughter. The daughter would have produced the managed Kwisatz Haderach. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would have attempted the species' salvation through means whose adequacy was uncertain. Love's path was terrible and sufficient. Duty's path was kinder and uncertain. The saga's preference, embedded in the narrative's structure rather than stated in the narrative's argument, is for the terrible sufficiency over the kind uncertainty. The comparison between the two universes, Paul's universe and the daughter's universe, is the comparison that illuminates both universes' character and that reveals what the what-if scenario ultimately demonstrates about the saga's construction. Paul's universe was violent. The jihad killed 61 billion people. The God Emperor's governance compressed human freedom for 3,500 years. The scattering dispersed populations into the unknown dark with the desperation of peoples fleeing from millennia of oppression. The violence was sustained, was comprehensive, was the defining feature of the universe's political landscape for the entirety of the saga's timeline. The daughter's universe was stable. The Corrino dynasty continued to govern. The Imperium's institutional architecture continued to function. The political landscape continued to operate within the frameworks that 10,000 years of Corrino governance had established. The stability was sustained, was comprehensive, was the defining feature of the universe's political landscape for the foreseeable future. The violence was productive. Paul's universe, for all its horror, produced the conditions for the species' survival, produced the jihad's disruption of the political monoculture, the God Emperor's governance of the Golden Path, the scattering's dispersal of human populations across the conditions the species' survival required. The horror was the medium of the production, and the production was the species' long-term survival. The stability was stagnant. The daughter's universe, for all its kindness, produced the conditions for the species' continued vulnerability, maintained the concentration that the Golden Path was designed to break, preserved the dependency on the single substance that the species' long-term survival could not afford, perpetuated the institutional monoculture that the species' diversification required the elimination of. The comparison reveals the saga's deepest argument about the relationship between comfort and survival. The comfortable path is not always the survivable path. The universe that preserved the most lives in the immediate term was the universe that threatened the most lives in the long term. The The universe that killed 61 billion in the short term was the universe that saved the species in the long term. The trade-off was not between good and bad. The trade-off was between immediate good and long-term survival, and the saga's construction, the what-if scenario confirms, consistently positions long-term survival as the value that justifies the cost of the immediate good sacrifice. The daughter herself, the person at the center of the scenario, the child who is supposed to be born, is the figure whose experience encapsulates the what-if scenario's meaning in its most personal form. The daughter was the compliant product, the result of Jessica's obedience, the breeding program's planned component, the vessel through which the institutional purpose was served. The daughter was what the institution wanted, what the 90-generation plan had specified. What the Sisterhood's calculations had determined was necessary for the Kwisatz Haderach's production on the schedule the program's design required. The daughter was also a person, not merely a genetic vehicle, a human being with the consciousness and the experience and the inner life that human beings carried, regardless of the institutional purposes their existence served. The daughter would have had preferences, attachments, dreams, the personal content that the institutional framework's genetic focus tended to overlook, but that the person's experience of the institutional framework's operations made impossible to ignore. The daughter's experience of the what-if scenario's events, the childhood on Caladan, the move to Arrakis, the assault, the desert, the extraction, the marriage, the production of the child who would be the Kwisatz Haderach, would have been the experience of a person whose life was organized around an institutional purpose she had not chosen. The purpose was imposed, determined by the breeding program's calculations rather than by the daughter's preferences, executed according to the institutional plan rather than according to the daughter's desires, justified by the institutional narrative about the Kwisatz Haderach's necessity rather than by any reference to the daughter's own understanding of what her life should be for. The daughter would have lived a life of service, not the Atreides tradition's governance as service, not the voluntary commitment to the governed that the Atreides ethic described, the Bene Gesserit's placement as service, the involuntary commitment to the institutional purpose that the placement protocol imposed, the subordination of the personal to the institutional that the breeding program's design required. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary service is the distinction that the daughter's experience illuminates. The Atreides tradition said, serve because the service is right. The Bene Gesserit plan said, serve because the service is required. The Atreides tradition honored the servant's autonomy. The Bene Gesserit plan subordinated the servant's autonomy. The daughter lived in the intersection of the two traditions, carrying the Atreides values that honored autonomy while being subject to the Bene Gesserit plan that subordinated it. The intersection was the daughter's prison. The awareness that her life was organized around a purpose she had not chosen, combined with the values that told her she should have the freedom to choose her own purposes, would have produced the tension that the intersection generated, the awareness of the discrepancy between what the values said she was entitled to and what the institutional plan said she was required to accept. The daughter might have rebelled, might have followed her mother's example, or rather, the example her mother had not set in the what-if scenario, but that the original timelines Jessica had set in the saga's actual history. The daughter might have refused the marriage, might have refused the placement, might have chosen her own path rather than the path the breeding program specified. If the daughter had rebelled against the plan that the mother's compliance had served, the rebellion would have been the what-if scenario's mirror of the original timeline's rebellion. Jessica rebelled by producing a son instead of a daughter, The daughter might have rebelled by refusing to produce the son the plan required, by choosing her own reproductive autonomy over the institutional plan's genetic directives, by insisting that her body and her choices were hers rather than the breeding program's. The rebellion's consequences would have been different from Jessica's rebellion's consequences. Different because the circumstances were different. Different because the political landscape was different. Different because the tools available to the rebel were different. But the rebellion's meaning would have been the same. The individual's refusal to accept the institutional purpose's authority over the individual's choices. The assertion that the person's autonomy is not subordinate to the institution's plans. The declaration that love, for the self, for the autonomy, for the right to choose, is more important than duty. The what-if scenario contains, in its deepest structure, the seeds of its own reversal. The obedient universe, the universe produced by Jessica's compliance, would have generated the conditions for the rebellion that Jessica's compliance was supposed to prevent. The daughter, raised in the Atreides tradition and formed by the Fremen culture, carrying the values that honoured autonomy and the experience that demonstrated autonomy's cost, would have confronted the institutional plan with the same quality of resistance that Jessica confronted the plan with in the original timeline. The rebellion was inevitable, not in the deterministic sense that the breeding program's product was guaranteed to reject the breeding program's purpose, in the structural sense that the conditions the obedient universe produced, the tension between the values and the plan, between the autonomy and the subordination, between what the person wanted and what the institution required, would have generated the rebellion that the institutional purpose's subordination of the personal always eventually generates. The institution could not control the product. This was true of Paul, the Kwisatz Haderach, who exceeded the institution's management by arriving one generation early. This would have been true of the daughter, the planned component, who exceeded the institution's management by carrying the values that the institution's plan could not accommodate. The breeding program could manage the genetics. The breeding program could not manage the person. The what-if scenario's final image is the image of two paths extending from a single decision point, Jessica's choice, daughter or son, and the two paths' comparative trajectories through the future's probability space. One path, the original timeline's path, leads through violence and horror, and the catastrophic destruction of 61 billion lives, through the God Emperor's millennial governance and the scattering's desperate dispersal, toward a future in which the species is diversified across enough conditions and enough locations that no single threat can eliminate it. The path is terrible. The path is, in the prescient vision's assessment, sufficient. The other path, the what-if scenario's path, leads through stability and institutional management and the kind preservation of the lives the other path would have consumed, through the managed Kwisatz Haderach's uncertain attempt at incremental dispersal toward a future whose sufficiency the prescient vision cannot confirm with the same confidence it brings to the assessment of the other path. The path is kind. The path is uncertain. The terrible sufficient path was produced by love, by Jessica's love for Leto, the love that produced the son the Duke wanted, the son whose capabilities the breeding program had not prepared for, the son whose unmanaged development produced the Jihad and the God Emperor, and the Golden Path. The kind, uncertain path would have been produced by duty, by Jessica's compliance with the breeding program's orders, the compliance that produced the daughter the institution required, the daughter whose managed placement produced the Kwisatz Haderach on schedule, the Kwisatz Haderach whose institutional development left the species' response to the existential threat in the domain of uncertainty. Love and duty. violence and stability, sufficiency and uncertainty. The what-if scenario presents the alternatives without resolving the assessment, because the assessment depends on what the assessor values: the immediate lives or the long-term survival, the kindness of the present or the security of the future, the mercy of the obedient path or the necessity of the disobedient one. Jessica chose love. The saga followed. The what-if scenario shows what would have followed if Jessica had chosen duty. The universe is different. The trade-off is the same. One decision. Daughter or son. The hinge of the saga. The hinge of the species. Jessica was supposed to have a daughter. She didn't. And everything followed from there. Gaius Helen Mohiam's role in the what-if scenario illuminates the Bene Gesserit's institutional perspective on the breeding program's management, and on the events the obedience would have produced. Mohiam was the Reverend Mother who tested Paul with the Gom Jabbar, the Bene Gesserit elder whose assessment of the Atreides heir was part of the institutional monitoring that the breeding program's management required. In the original timeline, Mohiam tested Paul and was disturbed by what she found. The boy's capability exceeded what the breeding program's timeline should have produced, suggesting the possibility that the Kwisatz Haderach had arrived one generation early, outside the institutional management that the Sisterhood's plan specified. In the what-if scenario, Mohiam would have tested the daughter. The Gom Jabbar test, the assessment of the heir's humanity through the application of pain, would have been administered to the daughter as it was administered to Paul, because the test was part of the breeding program's monitoring protocol, and the daughter was the breeding program's current generation's product. The daughter would have passed. The test assessed humanness, the capacity to subordinate the animal response to the human will. The daughter's Bene Gesserit training would have provided the mental discipline the test required, and the Atreides heritage would have provided the will's quality that the test was designed to detect. Mohiam's assessment of the daughter would have been different from her assessment of Paul. Where Paul's test produced alarm, the recognition that the boy's capabilities suggested a premature Kwisatz Haderach, the daughter's test would have produced satisfaction. The daughter was on schedule. The daughter was the product the program's current generation was supposed to produce. The daughter's capabilities were within the range the institutional timeline specified. Mohiam would have reported to the Sisterhood that the breeding program was proceeding according to plan. The satisfaction would have been the Bene Gesserit's institutional response to the obedient universe. The confirmation that the 90-generation plan was operating within its designed parameters, that the genetic management was producing the results the management specified, that the Kwisatz Haderach's production was on track for the next generation. The Sisterhood would have been pleased. The Sisterhood's pleasure would have been the pleasure of an institution whose most consequential project was proceeding as designed. The pleasure would have been premature, as the scenario's subsequent events would have demonstrated. The managed Kwisatz Haderach would have exceeded the Sisterhood's control regardless of the management's sophistication, because the prescient consciousness was structurally incompatible with institutional management. But the Sisterhood would not have known this at the testing stage. The Sisterhood would have been satisfied, and the satisfaction would have been the satisfaction of an institution that did not yet understand the limits of its own design. The Corrino dynasty's trajectory in the what-if scenario deserves extended attention, because the dynasty's continuation was the political framework within which the what-if scenario's events would have unfolded. Shaddam IV would have continued to govern. The conspiracy against the Atreides having succeeded completely, no surviving heir, no desert revolution, no Fremen mobilization. The dynasty would have emerged from the conspiracy's execution in the strengthened position the conspiracy was designed to produce. The Atreides threat was eliminated. The Lanthrad's admiration for the Atreides tradition was deprived of its object. The political dynamic that had driven Shaddam to the conspiracy was resolved. The resolution's cost would have been manageable. The conspiracy's execution, the Sardaukar in Harkonnen livery, the destruction of a noble house through disguised imperial military action, remained a secret that the dynasty's political management would have had to maintain. The secret was maintained in the original timeline until Paul's prescient perception exposed it. Without Paul's prescience, the secret would have remained secure. The intelligence that would have detected the Sartaukar's disguised participation was not available to any of the political landscape's conventional actors, and the conventional intelligence's limitations would have protected the dynasty's cover. The dynasty would have governed with the same institutional toolkit it had employed for 10,000 years: the Sardaukar, the Chom framework, the administrative apparatus, the diplomatic management of the Landsraad's political dynamics. The governance would have been competent. Shaddam was a capable ruler whose political training had prepared him for the governance's ordinary demands. And the dynasty's institutional culture would have continued to support the governance's operations. The Sardaukar's capability would have continued its gradual decline. The conditions on Seleucia Secundus that produced the Sardaukar's soldiers would have continued to operate, but the institutional attention to the conditions' maintenance, the attention that the dynasty's late-period institutional culture had allowed to diminish, would not have been restored by the what-if scenario's events. The Sardaukar would have remained the Imperium's most capable conventional military force, but the force's capability relative to the Fremen's capability would have continued to decline as the desert's undiminished harshness continued to produce warriors whose hardening exceeded what the prison planet's diminished conditions could match. The dynasty's succession would have proceeded. Shaddam would have been succeeded by an heir, by one of his daughters, or by the husband of one of his daughters, depending on the succession's political dynamics. The succession would have been managed through the institutional mechanisms the dynasty had maintained for 10,000 years: the assessment of the heirs, the training of the selected successor, the transmission of the governance tradition from one generation to the next. The dynasty would have faced the ecological crisis, the spice production's eventual decline, the consequence of the Fremen's terraforming program's progressive modification of the desert environment, would have presented the dynasty with a governance challenge that the dynasty's institutional toolkit was not designed to address. The dynasty would have had to manage the spice decline's political consequences without the ecological understanding that the crisis's resolution required, and without the institutional framework that the God Emperor's governance provided in the original timeline. The dynasty might have survived the crisis. The dynasty might not have survived. The dynasty's 10,000-year institutional culture included the capacity for adaptation, the ability to modify the governance's approach in response to changing conditions, the institutional flexibility that the dynasty's durability across millennia demonstrated. The adaptation might have been sufficient for the spice crisis's management. The adaptation might have been insufficient. The crisis's scale and the institutional toolkit's limitations might have exceeded the adaptation's capacity. The dynasty's trajectory in the what-if scenario was a trajectory of continuation followed by crisis, the continuation of the 10,000-year governance pattern followed by the ecological crisis that the continuation's political framework was not designed to address. The continuation was the what-if scenario's political stability. The crisis was the what-if scenario's political threat. The resolution of the threat, whether through the dynasty's adaptation or through the dynasty's failure, was the what-if scenario's political uncertainty. The spice economics of the what-if scenario would have been the dimension that connected the ecological trajectory to the political dynamics in the most consequential form. The spice economy was the Imperium's foundation, the melange's unique properties, the longevity extension, the cognitive enhancement, the navigational capability that the guild's prescient perception required, made the spice the most valuable substance in the known universe, and the substance on which the interstellar civilization's functioning depended. The spice economy, in the what-if scenario, would have continued to operate within the framework the Cho management provided. The Harkonnen governance of Arrakis would have maintained the spice production at the levels the economy required, extracting the melange from the desert through the harvesting operations that the governance's industrial infrastructure supported. The production would have been adequate. The Harkonnens were capable managers of the spice operation, regardless of the governance's other deficiencies. The terraforming's progressive impact on the spice production would have been the economy's long-term threat. The Fremen's ecological program, proceeding without the governance's knowledge or management, would have gradually reduced the desert's extent and modified the environmental conditions that the sandworm life cycle required. The reduction would have been reflected in the spice production's output, a gradual decline in the melange available for harvesting, a progressive reduction in the supply that the economy's demand structure required. The decline would have been detected. The Harkonnen governance's production monitoring would have identified the output reduction. The monitoring's attribution of the reduction, the identification of the cause, would have been more difficult, because the cause was ecological rather than operational, and the governance's analytical framework was designed to identify operational problems rather than ecological transformations. The investigation would have led to the discovery of the terraforming program. The Harkonnen governance, or the Imperial government, or the Choam analysis apparatus, or whatever institutional actor the investigation's requirements engaged, would have eventually identified the Fremen's ecological modification as the cause of the production decline. The discovery would have been a political crisis, the revelation that the Imperium's most valuable resource was being progressively destroyed by the indigenous population's ecological program. The response to the discovery would have been the what-if scenario's most consequential political event. The Imperium's institutional actors, the Emperor, the Landsraad, the Spacing Guild, the Chom framework, would have been confronted with a choice: permit the terraforming to continue and accept the spice production's decline, or suppress the terraforming and preserve the production. The suppression would have required the confrontation with the Fremen. The terraforming program was the Fremen's civilizational project, the dream that had organized Fremen culture for generations. The purpose that gave the Fremen's desert existence its meaning beyond survival. The suppression of the terraforming would have been experienced by the Fremen as the suppression of their civilization's defining purpose, and the suppression would have generated resistance at a level that exceeded anything the Harkonnen governance's security management had previously confronted. The Fremen's resistance would have been formidable. The desert warriors, trained by the desert's conditions to a capability that exceeded the Sardaukars, would have defended their ecological dream with the military capability their conditions had produced. The resistance would not have been the civilizational mobilization that Paul's messianic leadership produced in the original timeline. Would not have been the total war that Lisan al-Gaib's religious authority enabled. But the resistance would have been the defense of a civilization's core purpose by warriors whose individual capability exceeded anything the governance could field against them. The confrontation between the Imperium's need for spice and the Fremen's ecological dream would have been the what-if scenario's most dramatic conflict, the collision between the interstellar civilization's economic foundation and the indigenous population's civilizational purpose. The conflict would have been irreconcilable within the political framework's existing mechanisms, because the framework was not designed for the management of ecological conflicts between civilizations with incompatible purposes. The daughter's life, decade by decade, would have followed the trajectory the what-if scenario's political and genetic analysis implies, and tracing the trajectory illuminates the personal dimension of the scenario's events. The first decade, childhood on Caladan. The daughter would have grown up in the Atreides household, receiving the dual education the Bene Gesserit training and the Atreides tradition provided. The childhood would have been shaped by the household's warmth and by the awareness, progressively disclosed through the Bene Gesserit's developmental protocol, that the childhood's conditions were temporary, that the daughter's future included a placement that the household's conditions did not encompass. The move to Arrakis would have interrupted the childhood around the same age it interrupted Paul's, early adolescence, the developmental stage at which the Bene Gesserit training's more advanced elements were beginning to be accessible, and at which the personality's fundamental orientation was being consolidated. The move would have been experienced as displacement, the loss of Caladan's comforts, the confrontation with Arrakis's alien conditions, the awareness that the adult's anxiety about the move communicated something about the move's significance that the adolescent's understanding could not fully encompass. The assault and the desert flight would have occurred within the first year on Arrakis. The daughter would have been approximately the same age as Paul at the assault, old enough for the Bene Gesserit training to provide the survival tools the desert required, young enough for the trauma of the father's death and the household's destruction to produce the lasting impact that childhood trauma always produced. The desert years, the second phase, perhaps 2 to 5 years, would have been the daughter's formation's most consequential period. The Fremen culture's integration, the desert skills acquisition, the Bene Gesserit training's continuation under Jessica's instruction, the processing of the loss and the displacement, all of these would have occurred simultaneously, producing the composite formation that the scenario's earlier analysis described. The extraction and the marriage, the third phase. Occurring in the daughter's late adolescence or early adulthood would have been the transition from the desert life to the Harkonnen household. The transition would have been abrupt. The daughter would have moved from the Fremen's communal survival-oriented culture to the Harkonnens' hierarchical, power-oriented culture. And the move would have required the adaptation that the Bene Gesserit training was designed to support. The Harkonnen years, the fourth phase, encompassing the marriage to Feyd-Rautha, the management of the household, the production of the child, who would be the Kwisatz Haderach, would have been the daughter's adulthood's primary period. The years would have been characterized by the sustained navigation of the hostile household, the management of the relationship with Feyd, the cultivation of the institutional relationships the Bene Gesserit's intelligence network required, and the biological function the breeding program specified. The child's emergence, the fifth phase, occurring when the daughter was in middle age, would have been the period in which the daughter's role shifted from the breeding program's vessel to the Kwisatz Haderach's mother. The son's prescient emergence would have produced the crisis that the scenario's earlier analysis described, the moment at which the managed product exceeded the management's capacity, the moment at which the daughter's son became something the daughter's institutional framework could not contain. The daughter's response to the son's emergence would have been the what-if scenario's most personal moment. the moment at which the daughter, carrying the accumulated experience of the formations that had shaped her, confronted the reality that the child she had produced was becoming something that the production's purpose had not anticipated. The mother looking at the son and seeing in the son's prescient eyes the awareness that exceeded everything the mother's training and experience had prepared her for. The moment would have echoed Jessica's experience with Paul, the mother's recognition that the child was becoming something the mother's understanding could not fully encompass. But the daughter's experience would have been shaped by the what-if scenario's different context. The awareness that the child's becoming was the product of the institutional plan the daughter had served, that the plan's product was exceeding the plan's design, that the institution whose purpose the daughter had subordinated her autonomy to was losing control of the purpose's product. The awareness would have been vindicating. The daughter, whose life had been organized around the institutional purpose she had not chosen, would have watched the purpose's product demonstrate the purpose's inadequacy, would have seen the son's prescient consciousness exceed the institution's framework with the same structural inevitability that Paul's consciousness had exceeded it in the original timeline. The institution's plan had worked. The institution's control had failed. The distinction between the plan's success and the control's failure was the distinction that the daughter's experience illuminated. The Ixian technology dimension of the what-if scenario introduces a variable that the political and genetic analysis should account for. Because the Ixian's technological development would have continued along its trajectory regardless of the what-if scenario's political divergence, and the trajectory's products would have affected the scenario's long-term dynamics. The Ixians were the Imperium's primary technological innovators, the engineering tradition that pushed the boundaries of the Butlerian prohibition against thinking machines, developing technologies that approached and sometimes crossed the boundary the prohibition established. The Ixian development trajectory was institutional, driven by the Ixian culture's commitment to technological advancement and sustained by the economic demand for the technologies the advancement produced. In the original timeline, the Ixian trajectory produced technologies that the God Emperor's governance managed: the no ships, the Ixian navigation devices, the technological innovations that the post-God Emperor landscape would eventually deploy. The God Emperor's management included the suppression of technologies whose development threatened the Golden Path's design, and the accommodation of technologies whose development served the Path's objectives. In the what-if scenario, the Ixian trajectory would have proceeded without the God Emperor's management. The technologies would have been developed according to the trajectory's own logic, shaped by the economic demand and the Ixian culture's institutional momentum rather than by the comprehensive management the God Emperor provided. The development would have been faster in some dimensions the God Emperor's management suppressed, and slower in others, dimensions the God Emperor's management accelerated. The most consequential Ixian development for the what-if scenario would have been the navigation machines, the technological devices designed to replicate the Guild Navigator's prescient perception through mechanical rather than biological means. The navigation machine's development was a long-term trajectory that the Ixian tradition had been pursuing for centuries, and the development's eventual success would have threatened the Guild's navigational monopoly by providing an alternative to the spice-dependent biological navigation the Guild provided. The navigation machine's availability would have changed the spice crisis's dynamics. If the machines could provide interstellar navigation without the spice consumption the biological navigators required, the spice supply's decline would have been less catastrophic. The civilization's capacity for interstellar travel would have been partially preserved through the technological alternative, and the spice economy's collapse would have been an economic crisis rather than a civilizational one. The what-if scenario's long-term trajectory might have included the transition from spice-based navigation to machine-based navigation, a transition that would have reduced the civilization's dependency on Arrakis and on the sandworm ecology that the terraforming was threatening. The transition would have been resisted by the Guild, whose institutional identity and whose political power were organized around the navigational monopoly that the machine's availability would have destroyed. But the resistance might not have been sufficient to prevent the transition if the spice supply's decline made the transition necessary. The navigation machine's availability introduces a thread of technological hope into the what-if scenario's otherwise darkening trajectory. The spice crisis might have been manageable if the technology provided an alternative to the spice dependency. The civilization might have survived the sandworm ecology's decline if the navigation machines replaced the biological navigators. The species' survival might have been achievable through technological diversification rather than through the Golden Path's comprehensive dispersal. The hope is conditional. The navigation machine's development was not guaranteed, the technology's timeline was uncertain, the engineering challenges were substantial, and the political resistance from the Guild and from the defenders of the Butlerian prohibition might have delayed or prevented the development's success. The hope was possible. The hope was not assured. The Mentat's role in the what-if scenario would have been shaped by the political landscape's continuation of the existing order's institutional framework, and the role illuminates the relationship between human cognitive capability and the institutional purposes the capability served. The Mentats, the human computers whose training replicated the thinking machine's analytical function through biological capability, were integral to the Imperium's governance apparatus. Every major institution employed Mentats: the noble houses, the commercial organizations, the military establishments. The Mentat capability was the cognitive infrastructure that the Butlerian prohibition's computational gap required. In the what-if scenario, the Mentat tradition would have continued to operate within the existing institutional framework. The Mentats would have served the noble houses, the CHOAM framework, the imperial government with the analytical capability the governance required. The tradition would have developed along its established trajectory, refining the training methods, deepening the analytical capabilities, producing the human computers that the civilization's cognitive demands required. The managed Kwisatz Haderach's relationship with the Mentat tradition would have been a significant dimension of the scenario's institutional dynamics. The Kwisatz Haderach's prescient capability included computational functions that exceeded the Mentat tradition's capability. The ability to process probability spaces, to integrate multiple data streams simultaneously, to perceive patterns that the Mentat's analytical processing could identify but that the prescient perception could apprehend directly. The Kwisatz Haderach would have rendered the Mentat tradition partially obsolete, not in the routine analytical functions that the governance's daily operations required. The Mentat's capabilities would have remained useful for the computational demands that the governance generated. In the strategic functions, the assessment of complex political situations, the evaluation of long-term consequences, the kind of analysis that the governance's most consequential decisions required, the Kwisatz Haderach's prescient perception would have exceeded the Mentat capability by a margin that made the Mentat analysis secondary to the prescient assessment. The partial obsolescence would have produced institutional tension. The Mentat tradition's practitioners, trained human computers whose identity was organized around the cognitive capability they provided, would have experienced the Kwisatz Haderach's prescient superiority as a threat to the tradition's institutional relevance. The tension would have been another dimension of the political dynamics the managed Kwisatz Haderach's emergence produced. Another source of the resistance that the existing order's institutional actors would have opposed to the transformation the prescient vision demanded. The Bene Gesserit's institutional trajectory in the what-if scenario would have been the most consequential institutional narrative after the managed Kwisatz Haderach's emergence, because the Sisterhood's response to the product's uncontrollability would have determined the institution's future. The Sisterhood had spent 90 generations preparing for the Kwisatz Haderach, the breeding program, the institutional project that had organized the Sisterhood's most consequential activities across millennia of sustained effort, had been designed to produce a super being whose capabilities the Sisterhood would manage. The program's success and the management's failure would have been the Sisterhood's most consequential institutional crisis. The crisis would have forced an institutional reckoning. The Sisterhood would have had to confront the reality that the 90-generation project's foundational assumption, the assumption that the product could be controlled, was wrong. The confrontation would have required the Sisterhood to reassess its institutional identity, to ask whether the institution whose primary purpose had been the production of the Kwisatz Haderach still had a purpose now that the production had occurred and the management had failed. The reckoning would have been difficult. The Sisterhood's institutional culture was organized around the breeding program, the program's objectives, the program's methods, the program's institutional narratives about the Kwisatz Haderach's significance and the Sisterhood's role in the Kwisatz Haderach's management. The program's failure to produce a controllable product would have undermined the institutional culture's organizing principle, and the undermining would have produced the kind of institutional crisis that institutions whose founding purposes have been fulfilled or invalidated experience. The Sisterhood might have adapted. The Bene Gesserit tradition included institutional flexibility, the capacity to reassess, to redirect, to modify the institutional purpose in response to changing circumstances. The Sisterhood might have identified new purposes, might have redirected the institutional capabilities that the breeding program had developed toward objectives that the post-Kwisatz Haderach landscape made available. The political networking, the intelligence operations, the training tradition. The institutional capabilities were real and were not contingent on the breeding program's specific objective. The Sisterhood might also have fragmented. The institutional crisis might have produced internal divisions between the factions that wanted to maintain the institutional culture's existing orientation and the factions that advocated the redirection. The divisions might have been managed through the institutional mechanisms the Sisterhood maintained for the resolution of internal disagreements. The divisions might have exceeded the mechanism's capacity. The what-if scenario's Bene Gesserit was a Bene Gesserit facing its founding purpose's completion and its management's failure simultaneously, an institution that had achieved its objective and lost its product in the same moment. The institution's response to this simultaneous achievement and loss would have determined the Sisterhood's future, would have shaped the Bene Gesserit's role in the what-if scenario's political landscape for the generations that followed the managed Kwisatz Haderach's emergence. The deep time implications of the what-if scenario, the consequences that extended beyond the generations the scenario's analysis can trace with confidence, are the implications that connect the scenario to the saga's largest arguments about the species' trajectory. The species, in the what-if scenario, would have continued to exist within the single political framework the Carino dynasty administered. The concentration would have deepened, the institutional monoculture would have become more entrenched, the dependency on the spice would have remained total. The species' vulnerability to a single catastrophic event would have increased with each generation of continued concentration. The species might have diversified through natural processes. The exploration and colonization that the interstellar civilization's expansion had included in its earlier centuries might have continued, might have pushed human populations into territories that the Carino governance's administrative framework did not fully encompass. The diversification would have been partial, would have extended the species' range without breaking the institutional monoculture that connected the range's components. The partial diversification might have been sufficient. The threat that the Golden Path was designed to address was the concentration, the vulnerability of a species sitting in one basket. A species that had diversified partially, that had extended its range and reduced its concentration without the comprehensive dispersal the scattering produced, might have survived the threat that the complete concentration would have made lethal. The sufficiency is the what-if scenario's deepest uncertainty. The scenario cannot determine whether the partial diversification would have been enough, whether the species' extended range and reduced concentration would have provided the survival margin the threat required. The determination depends on the threat's nature and its scale, and the prescient vision that would have provided the determination was not available in the form the original timeline's events made it available. The what-if scenario's universe was a universe of partial measures and uncertain outcomes. The managed Cuisart's Haderach's insider revolution, the partial diversification's uncertain sufficiency, the Ixian machine's conditional availability, the institutional landscape's gradual transformation. Each element was a partial response to the species' existential challenge, and the partial response's combined sufficiency was the what-if scenario's unanswerable question. The original timeline's events, however terrible, had the merit of comprehensiveness. The Golden Path was a total response to the total threat. The scattering was a comprehensive dispersal across the comprehensive vulnerability. The God Emperor's governance addressed the species' survival with the systematic thoroughness that the threat scale required. The comprehensiveness came at a cost. The jihad, the compression, the millennia of enforced stagnation. But the comprehensiveness addressed the threat with the confidence that partial measures could not provide. The what-if scenario traded the comprehensiveness for the kindness, traded the confident sufficiency for the uncertain adequacy, traded the terrible necessity for the merciful contingency. The trade was Jessica's. The trade was made in the moment of the decision, daughter or son, duty or love, the institution's plan or the heart's desire. The ordinary population's experience of the what-if scenario, the billions of people across hundreds of worlds whose lives would have been shaped by the political landscape the what-if scenario produced, is the dimension that the analysis of empires and institutions sometimes overlooks, but that the scenario's human significance depends on. For the ordinary person on a governed world, the farmer, the factory worker, the merchant, the clerk, whose daily existence was shaped by the governance's conditions rather than by the governance's decisions. The what-if scenario's political stability would have been experienced as continuity. The same imperial taxation, the same chome commerce, the same administrative framework that organized the economic activity and adjudicated the disputes and maintained the social order the population lived within. The continuity would have been unremarkable, would have been the ongoing reality of a political arrangement that the governed had never known the alternative to. The governed would not have known what they were spared. The 61 billion who would have died in the jihad, who lived in the what-if scenario, who continued their ordinary lives without the war that the original timeline imposed, would not have been aware that an alternative timeline existed in which they were killed. The mercy of the what-if scenario was invisible to the people who received it, because the mercy consisted of the non-occurrence of an event they had no reason to anticipate. The governed would not have known what they were heading toward. The species' existential threat, the concentration's vulnerability, the dependency's danger, was invisible to ordinary perception. The governed would have experienced the political landscape's continuation as stability, as the positive condition of a functioning civilization, rather than as the negative condition of a species approaching a danger it could not see. The threat was real. The threat was invisible. The governed were heading toward it without awareness. This is the what-if scenario's most poignant dimension. The governed populations would have been grateful for the stability, would have preferred the continuity to the disruption, would have chosen, if the choice had been offered, the continuation of the existing order over the catastrophic transformation that the original timeline produced. The governed would have been right to prefer the stability, right in the immediate sense that the stability preserved their lives and their communities and their daily existence. The governed would also have been wrong in the long-term sense that the stability they preferred was the condition that the species' existential vulnerability was organized around. The tension between the governed population's rational preference for stability and the species' long-term need for disruption is the tension that the what-if scenario places at the center of the saga's political argument. The governed were rational. The governed were also vulnerable. The rationality produced the preference for stability. The vulnerability required the disruption of the stability. The preference and the requirement were irreconcilable, and the irreconcilability was the tragedy the what-if scenario illuminated. The original timeline resolved the irreconcilability through violence, through the jihad's destruction of the stability the governed preferred, through the God Emperor's imposition of the conditions the species' survival required. The resolution was imposed on the governed. The governed did not choose it. The governed suffered it. The suffering was the cost of the resolution. The what-if scenario did not resolve the irreconcilability. The stability continued. The vulnerability deepened. The governed were comfortable. The species was endangered. The comfort and the danger coexisted, and the coexistence was the what-if scenario's defining condition. The condition of a civilization whose immediate experience was positive and whose long-term trajectory was negative, whose populations were satisfied and whose species was threatened. The condition is not unique to the what-if scenario. The condition is the condition of any civilization whose immediate stability is maintained at the cost of long-term adaptability. Any civilization whose success in the present reduces its capacity for responding to the challenges the future will generate. The what-if scenario presents the condition in its most extreme form. 10,000 years of sustained stability producing the vulnerability that the stability's beneficiaries cannot perceive, but the condition's logic applies to civilizations of any scale and any duration. The what-if scenario is, in this dimension, the saga's most sustained argument about the cost of comfort. The argument says, comfort is not free. The comfort of the present is purchased with the adaptability of the future. The longer the comfort is maintained, the higher the future's cost. The species that is comfortable for 10,000 years is the species that has spent 10,000 years accumulating the vulnerability that the comfort's maintenance produces. Jessica's obedience would have purchased the comfort. Jessica's rebellion purchased the adaptability. The purchase was made in a moment. The cost was paid across millennia. The what-if scenario's final accounting is the accounting of what Jessica's obedience would have cost and what it would have preserved, weighed against what Jessica's rebellion cost and what it produced. The obedience would have cost the Atreides name's continuation as a governing house. The Atreides tradition would have survived, would have been carried by the daughter into the Harkonnen household, would have been transmitted to the son whose formation included the mother's influence. But the Atreides name, the Atreides house, the political identity that the Atreides tradition was associated with, this would have ended with Leto's death at the Harkonnen assault. The house would have been destroyed. The tradition would have survived in a form that did not carry the house's name. The obedience would have cost the prescient confidence in the species' survival path. The managed Kwisatz Haderach's response to the existential threat would have been guided by a prescient vision whose confidence about the response's adequacy was less than the confidence Leto the Kend brought to the Golden Path. The species would have faced the threat with a response whose sufficiency was uncertain rather than with a response whose sufficiency was confirmed. The obedience would have preserved 61 billion lives. The jihad would not have occurred. The interstellar war that the Fremen's weaponized faith produced, the most destructive conflict in human history, would not have happened. The worlds that were devastated would have been spared. The populations that were killed would have survived. The obedience would have preserved the Imperium's institutional continuity. The political framework that 10,000 years of Corino governance had produced, the tripod, the Cho management, the administrative apparatus, the diplomatic mechanisms, would have continued to function. The political rupture that Paul's revolution produced, the sudden displacement of the dynasty, the installation of the messianic governance, the transformation of the political order into a theocratic empire, would not have occurred. The obedience would have preserved 3,500 years of human political freedom. The God Emperor's governance, the compression of human autonomy that the Golden Path required, would not have been imposed. The populations would not have experienced the millennia of enforced stagnation that Leto II management of the Golden Path demanded. The freedom that the God Emperor took would have remained available. The rebellion cost 61 billion lives. The jihad's killing, the 90 world's devastation, the most destructive single period in human history. The rebellion cost 3,500 years of human freedom. The God Emperor's compression, the enforced stagnation, the millennia of managed existence. The rebellion produced the Golden Path, the comprehensive response to the species' existential threat, the dispersal, the scattering, the diversification that the species' long-term survival required. The rebellion produced certainty, the prescient vision's confirmation that the Golden Path was sufficient, that the response would work, that the species would survive, that the path through the violence and the compression and the scattering led to the survival the species needed. Jessica chose the rebellion, chose Paul, chose love over duty, the son over the daughter, the man over the institution. Everything followed. The what-if scenario shows what would have followed if she had chosen differently. A kinder universe, a more uncertain future, a species that might have survived, a species that might not have. The kindness or the certainty, the mercy or the sufficiency, the daughter or the son. Jessica chose the son. The universe she produced was terrible and sufficient. The daughter's universe would have been kind and uncertain. The choice was Jessica's. The consequences were everyone's. What if Jessica had a daughter instead of Paul? The universe would have been different. The trade-off would have been the same.